The deputy clerk at the Pembina land office smelled like wet wool and lamp oil. He watched the woman standing at the counter, young, thin wristed, her coat patched at both elbows, while the storekeeper across from her slid a folded paper across the wood. The paper made a sound like a card being dealt. Outside, a draft mare stamped at the hitching rail, and the sound carried through the frozen glass. The woman reached for the paper, but the storekeeper's fingers stayed on it. He did not let go. He smiled, and the clerk looked away, because some transactions are easier not to witness. Olabrecka had been dead 6 weeks when the first hard frost split the water pail inside the shack. Marit found the crack at dawn, her breath hanging in a column above the blanket. She pressed her thumb against the iron seam and felt the ridge where ice had pushed the metal apart. The stove held nothing but white ash. She had burned her last cottonwood splits during the night, and the pile beside the door, 1 3/4 cords of soft, punky wood that Ole had cut before the accident, looked like what it was. Not enough. Not close to enough. 6 weeks earlier, Ole had been hauling rails from a deadfall stand 4 miles east of the claim. The sled runner caught a frozen rut, the load shifted, and 3 rails pinned him across the hip and chest before the draft mare, Sol, dragged the wreck sideways into a ditch. A neighbor found him before dark. He died on the cabin floor 2 days later, speaking Norwegian in a voice Merritt had never heard him use. A child's voice calling for his mother across an ocean that had swallowed her years ago. What Ole left behind fit on a short list. 160 acres of filed claim near a Pembina River coulee in northeastern Dakota Territory. A shack 12 feet by 16 feet with 3 finished walls, 1 wall still lined in tar paper, and a roof that lifted at the north corner when wind pushed from the west. A pregnant draft mare named Sol, who stood 17 hands and had a habit of planting her hooves when she sensed unsound ground. 2 sacks of flour, 1 sack of beans, a cracked stove with a bowed pipe joint, $27 in paper currency folded inside a Bible, and a debt to Warren Pike's store of $43.08 for nails, flour, coffee, and stovepipe. Marit could not leave. The claim was filed in Ole's name with her listed as spouse, and the improvements, the fence posts, the half-finished shack, the broken sod on 12 acres, represented 8 months of labor that would revert to open territory if she abandoned before proving up. Pike would buy the relinquishment for less than the debt. Ole's grave sat 40 yards from the shack door, marked with a rail from the load that killed him. Walking away meant losing the land, the labor, and the only ground in America where she had buried someone she loved. The survival math was brutal. A tight claim shack in Dakota Territory required a minimum of 6 cords of dense hardwood, oak, elm, ash, to hold through winter. Marit had 1 3/4 cords of cottonwood, which burned fast, threw sparks against dry wood, and left almost no coal bed. Cottonwood delivered roughly half the heat of oak per cord. She needed 3 times what she had, in wood 3 times as dense. $27 might buy 2 cords from the fuel dealer in town, but 2 cords plus 1 3/4 of cottonwood still left her short, and $27 was also her flour money, her feed money, and the margin between eating in February and not eating at all. She stood in the doorway of the shack that morning and looked at the woodpile. The cold pressed against her face like a flat hand. Sewell stood at the picket line with her head low, vapor rising from her nostrils in slow pulses. The sky was the color of old tin. Somewhere south, the road to town was already rutted with frost, and in 6 weeks it would be impassable. Marit did not cry. She had cried when Ole died. She had cried when the neighbor's wife brought broth and looked at the shack walls and said nothing. She had finished with crying. What she needed now was wood, and wood did not come from grief. Tolif Asen arrived on the third day after the pail cracked. He came without invitation, which was his way. Tolif was 58 years old, Norwegian-born, a former timberman who had logged Wisconsin pine before the land gave out and pushed him west onto Dakota grass. He had survived 4 Dakota winters on his own claim 8 miles south, and he considered himself an authority on what it took to keep a household from freezing, because he was. He walked the property the way a man walks a horse he is deciding not to buy. He tapped the stovepipe with his knuckle and listened to the ring. He slid 2 fingers between the wall boards on the north side and held them there, feeling the draft. He kicked the base of the cottonwood pile and watched the splits roll. He lifted the tar paper on the east wall and let it fall. "You have a summer box," Tolif said, "not a winter house." Marit stood by the door with her arms crossed, not against him but against the wind that came through the gap where the frame had settled unevenly on its sill logs. Tolif pointed at the woodpile. "How much?" 1 3/4, maybe less. Some of it is punky at the center." "Cottonwood." "Cottonwood." Tolif shook his head. He walked to the north wall and pressed his palm flat against the boards. "These gaps need chinking, mud, grass, and lime if you can get it. The roof corner needs weight, or it will peel back in the first real blow. The stovepipe joint is cracked. You will lose heat up the wall, and smoke will back into the room when the wind shifts north." He pulled his hand away and looked at her. "A real Dakota winter needs a tight cabin, banked walls, a sound stove, and hardwood, real hardwood. Oak, elm, even ash. You have none of these." "I have the claim," Marit said. "The claim does not keep you warm." "It keeps me here." Tolif's face did not soften. He was not a soft man, and he did not believe in softness as a winter strategy. He looked at the cottonwood pile again, looked at the mare standing heavy at the picket, and looked at the horizon where the Pembina River coulee cut a dark line through the white grass. "Sell," he said, "before the snow locks the road. Pike will offer less in February than he will in December. Take what he gives, board in town until spring, file again somewhere else. Ola is buried here. Ola is dead. The dead do not need 160 acres. Marit said nothing to that, because Tolif was not wrong about the dead, only about the living. She showed him the claim receipt with both names on it, the marked fence line, the 12 acres of broken sod. She showed him Sewell, whose belly was beginning to round with a foal that would arrive in March if the mare survived that long. Tolif looked at all of it. Then he said the thing that settled in Marit's chest like a stone. "You will not make it to January." He left without offering to help, because Tolif Asen believed that false encouragement killed people faster than cold. He believed the kindest thing he could do for a 23-year-old widow with bad wood and a broken shack was to tell her to leave while the leaving was possible. He was not cruel. He was experienced, and experience had taught him that Dakota did not negotiate. 3 days after Tolif's visit, Warren Pike sent a letter. It arrived with the mail rider, folded in brown paper, sealed with store wax. Pike was 42 years old, the operator of the general store and note holder for half the small claims along the Pembina Road. He was not large, but he was patient, and patience in a creditor is more dangerous than size. The letter was short. It reminded Marit that her account stood at $43.08. It noted that the terms allowed 30 days before collection action. It offered, as a courtesy, to discuss alternate arrangements if Marit wished to visit the store before the 1st of December. The last line read, "No shame in admitting the prairie is too much for one woman." Marit read it twice. The second time she read it aloud to Sewell, who stood in the lean-to chewing frozen grass and did not react. Marit folded the letter and placed it inside the Bible with the $27. The letter was worth more than the money would run out. The letter would remind her, every time she opened the book, what Pike expected her to do. Pike's arithmetic was simple and public. If Marit failed, the claim reverted. If the claim reverted, Pike could acquire it at land office minimum tire, $1.25 per acre, and sell the improvements, the sod, and the location for 3 or 4 times that to the next hopeful family coming up the road. Ole's 8 months of fence posts and broken ground would become Pike's profit margin. The debt was not charity. The debt was a seed planted in the expectation of failure. Marit understood this because she had watched Pike operate since she and Ole arrived in the spring. Pike extended credit the way a trapper sets snares, gently in places where the animal had no other path. Nails, flour, coffee, stovepipe, the things a homesteader could not do without and could not get elsewhere within 40 miles. Every purchase tightened the line. Every missed payment gave Pike another inch of leverage. What Pike did not understand, what no one along the Pembina Road understood yet, was that Marit Brecka had no intention of failing quietly. She had not crossed the Atlantic in a cargo hold, married a man who spoke more to horses than to people, broken sod until her shoulders ached in places she did not know. Shoulders could ache, and buried that man in frozen ground with her own hands, only to hand the result to a storekeeper who smelled opportunity in her grief. She did not have a plan. She had a refusal. And in Dakota Territory in the winter of 1887, a refusal was the first and sometimes only material a plan could be built from. The wood problem drove everything. Without fuel, the shack was a box. Without the shack, the claim was empty. Without the claim, Marit was a widow with $27, a pregnant mare, and nowhere that law or family required anyone to take her in. She tried the conventional approach first because desperation makes people conventional before it makes them creative. On a Tuesday in mid-November, she hitched Saul to the sled and drove east toward a willow draw 6 miles from the claim. The willows grew thick along a frozen creek bed, and Marit had seen other settlers haul brush from the draw when their wood piles ran low. The work was terrible. Willows do not split clean. They bend, they twist, they hold moisture in their cores even when the bark looks dry. Marit spent 4 hours with the axe and a handsaw, cutting and loading, and when she turned Saul toward the home, the sled carried a load that looked impressive and weighed almost nothing. Wet willow, twisted ash roots pulled from frozen ground, brush that would burn fast and hot and leave her with smoke and no coals. She drove home with the wind at her back and the knowledge that 6 more trips like this would not save her. Even if she filled the sled every day for 2 weeks, she would have volume without density. The shack would eat it like paper. The next day she tried again. Different direction. South toward a ravine where she had seen standing dead wood in October. The dead wood was still there, but most of it was elm that had died with moisture trapped inside, and when she struck it with the axe, the heartwood was soft and dark. She loaded what she could. The sled was heavier this time, but not by much. On the 3rd trip, she went northwest, following the coulee rim toward a line of trees she could see from the shack roof on clear days. This was farther than she had gone alone, nearly 8 miles, and Saul moved with the slow reluctance of a horse that knows the day is already too short for the distance. They reached the tree line by late morning. The trees were box elders and a few stunted oaks. Real wood, dense wood, the kind Tollef would have approved. But the oaks were alive, thick-trunked, and Marit's axe was meant for splitting, not felling. She could not drop a 12-inch oak alone, buck it, split it, load it, and drive 8 miles home before dark. The math was physical, not financial, and it was just as impossible. She cut what she could, small branches, deadfall, one oak limb that had cracked in an ice storm and hung low enough to reach. The sled was a quarter full when the light began to fail. On the drive home, Sewell did something that Marit would remember for the rest of her life. The route crossed a flat, snow-covered swale about 2 miles from the claim. Marit had crossed it before without trouble. The snow was level, the ground beneath it firm enough for a sled. But on this day, Sewell stopped. She planted her front hooves, lowered her head, and refused to move forward. Marit pulled the reins. Sewell did not move. Marit clucked, slapped the leather against the harness, spoke in Norwegian, spoke in English. Saul stood like a post driven into frozen earth. Her ears were forward, locked on the ground ahead, and her nostrils flexed in a rhythm Marit had never seen. Not panic, not cold, something else. She was testing the air. Marit cursed the horse. She was cold, the light was going, and the sled was too light to justify the day. She stepped down from the bench and walked to Sewell's head. The mare's eyes were wide, but not wild. She was refusing the way a horse refuses a rotten bridge, not from fear, but from knowledge. Marit looked at the snow. It was flat, unmarked, nothing visible. She took a step forward past Sewell's head, and her boot punched through the crust into air. Not ground. Air. She stumbled, caught herself, and heard a sound beneath her. A dull, hollow resonance like a hand slapped against an empty barrel. She dropped to her knees. She brushed snow with her mittens. Beneath 6 inches of crust and powder, her fingers hit wood, not roots, not frozen brush. Planks. Square-cut planks, gray with age, laid edge to edge and half buried in packed earth. Sewell had refused to cross because the ground was not ground. It was a roof. Marit knelt in the snow until her knees burned. She cleared more snow, working outward from the first plank. The planks ran in a line roughly 6 feet across, set on cross beams that she could feel but not see beneath the surface. The wood was oak, old, gray, but dense. When she struck it with the back of the axe head, it rang rather than thudded, not rotten, dry. She pried one plank with the axe blade. It resisted, then lifted with a crack of frozen dirt and ancient nail. Below was darkness. She smelled cold stone, dry wood dust, and something faintly acrid, old smoke, long dead, baked into earth and timber. She dropped a pebble into the opening. It fell for longer than she expected. A full second, maybe more, before it clicked against something hard below. Deep. Whatever this was, it was deep. Her father's voice came to her then, not as memory, but as fact. In Norway, in the stone dairy beneath the family house, her father had pressed her hand against the wall and said, "Feel. The earth keeps its own warmth. Wind steals heat. Earth holds it." He had shown her the vents, low openings plugged with moss in winter, opened in summer, and explained that below the frost the ground stayed the same temperature whether the air above was warm or freezing. She had been 9 years old, and the lesson had seemed as permanent and unimportant as the stone itself. Now, kneeling on a hidden roof 2 miles from her inadequate shack, with a quarter sled of scrub wood and a mare that understood the ground better than she did, the lesson came back with the force of something that had always been waiting. She did not know what was below. She did not know if it was safe, stable, or useful, but she knew 3 things. The planks were oak, the air smelled dry, and the earth beneath Dakota snow was warmer than the wind above it. She replaced the plank, marked the spot with a willow branch driven into the snow, and drove Saul home in the last light. She did not tell anyone what she had found. Louisa Meacham appeared the next afternoon. Louisa was 31, a neighbor 3 miles east, the mother of 3 children under the age of 8. and the most practically minded woman Marit had met in Dakota. Louisa did not gossip for entertainment. She gossiped for intelligence. She tracked who had wood, who had flour, who was sick, and who was likely to leave because in a settlement where the nearest doctor was 2 days away, knowing your neighbor's weaknesses was a survival skill. She found Marit digging. Marit had returned to the swale at first light with a shovel, a length of rope, and a candle stub in a tin cup. She had cleared a section of the planked roof, roughly 4 feet by 6 feet, and was working the edge of a second plank free when Louisa's wagon appeared on the coulee road. Louisa climbed down, walked to the edge of the hole, and looked in. "What is this?" "I do not know yet." "It looks like a grave." "Graves do not have roofs." Louisa studied the planks, the depth, the cleared snow. Her face held the expression of a woman who is calculating whether to help or to warn, and choosing to warn first. "A hole in winter is not a house," Louisa said. "It is a grave with steps, old timber rots, trapped air kills. One woman cannot shore a collapse." She looked at Marit. "If you fall in and break your leg, no one will find you until spring." "The wood is dry," Marit said. "I dropped a candle. It burned." "A candle burns in many places that kill the person holding it." Marit did not argue, because Louisa was not wrong. Old structures failed. Trapped spaces held bad air. A lone woman with no one to pull her out was one misstep from a death no one would discover in time. These were facts, and Marit respected Louisa enough not to dismiss them. But Marit had seen something that Louisa had not. She had noticed the evening before that the snow around the plank seams had melted in a faint ring. Not much. A few inches of bare ground where the edges met, as if warmth were breathing upward through the cracks. The air above was 12 degrees below zero. The ground around the planks was bare. "Why is the snow melted here?" Marit asked. "It is below zero. Snow does not melt below zero unless something beneath it is warmer than the air." Louisa looked at the ring of bare earth. She did not have an answer. She looked at Marit with the expression of a woman who recognizes the moment when a neighbor stops being sensible and starts being something else, either brilliant or doomed, and too early to tell which. "You are going to go down there," Louisa said. It was not a question. "I am going to lower a candle first, then a lantern, then a smoking rag to see which way the air moves. If the air moves, it means there are vents. If there are vents, the air is not trapped." Louisa watched Marit lower the candle on a length of twine. The flame descended into darkness, flickering in a draft that came from somewhere below and to the left. It did not gutter. It did not die. It burned steady and then brighter as it reached a depth where the air was still and dry. Marit pulled it up. She lowered a tin cup on the same twine. When she brought it back, the cup was dry. No water pooling below. No seepage. She smelled the air coming up through the gap. Old smoke, wood dust, dry clay. No rot. No mold. No animal musk. "Someone built this," Marit said, "and they left it full." Louisa looked at the hole, at Marit, at the horizon where the sky was already thickening with the gray weight of coming snow. She said, "Be careful," which was the most Louisa Meacham ever promised anyone, and she drove home. The question was not, "Can I live underground?" That came later. The first question was smaller and more dangerous. What exactly is beneath these planks? Marit spent 2 days working the entrance open. She levered planks, cleared frozen soil, and rigged a rope ladder from the sled frame and harness straps. On the second afternoon, she lowered herself into the darkness. The space was larger than she expected. The entrance hatch, once cleared, opened into a drop of roughly 9 feet. She measured by lowering the rope and marking it against her arm span. At the bottom, the floor was packed clay, dry and cracked in a pattern that meant it had been dry for years. The walls were clay-banked and shored with oak posts, thick as her thigh, set at intervals of roughly 4 feet. Cross braces of tamarack poles ran between the posts at shoulder height. She stood in the dark and held the lantern high. The main chamber extended roughly 26 feet long and 14 feet wide. One end, the south end she guessed from the direction of the entrance, had a lower bay that dropped another 11 feet, making the deepest point roughly 20 feet below the surface. The lower bay's walls were reinforced with double posts and additional clay packing, and along the west wall of the lower bay, stacked on raised rails 3 inches above the clay floor, was wood. Not willow, not cottonwood, not the punky, spongy, half-rotten scrub she had been hauling in desperation from every draw and ravine within 8 miles. Hardwood, split hardwood, hickory, bur oak, white oak, pieces thick as a man's forearm, split clean, stacked bark side up with air gaps between each row, arranged on rails that kept them off the damp floor. The outer pieces, the ones closest to the walls, again were punky at the edges, soft with age and slow moisture. But the inner rows, protected by the outer layer, rang hard and clean when Merritt struck them with her knuckle. She stood in the dark at the bottom of a buried chamber that no one had entered in what looked like decades, and felt something she had not felt since Ole died. Not hope. Hope was too large and too fragile. What she felt was the specific physical recognition that the numbers might change. She counted the visible rows. She estimated the depth of the stack. She was not a timberman, but she had watched Ole measure, and she had loaded enough sleds to know the difference between a quarter cord and a full cord by sight. The accessible wood in the lower bay looked like 4 cords, maybe more. 4 cords of dense, dry, 50-year-old hardwood that had been sealed underground, protected from rain and snow and rot by a collapsed but intact roof and the steady temperature of deep earth. 4 cords of hardwood plus her 1 3/4 of cottonwood might be enough to keep a stove burning through a Dakota winter. If the wood was truly dry, if the chamber was truly stable, if the vents could be cleared, if she could move the stove below, if she could solve the smoke problem, if Pike did not find out and claim the structure, if the whole thing did not collapse on her head while she slept. But 4 cords was 4 cords, and Marit Breka, who had $27 and a pregnant mare and a dead husband and a shack that could not hold heat, was standing in a room where the air was warmer than the air above, and the wood was denser than anything she could buy, borrow, or steal within 40 miles. She climbed out before dark. She replaced the planks. She drove home and fed Saul an extra measure of grain from the sack she could not afford to use. That night, she lay in the shack and listened to the cottonwood crackle in the stove and calculated. The stove would need to be moved below. The vents would need to be found and cleared. The roof would need to be stabilized enough to hold snow weight. The entrance would need to be made safe for repeated use. All of this was work for a crew, and she was one woman, but the room existed. The wood existed. The earth held warmth that the shack could not. She had not yet found a plan. She had found a question. Was the buried chamber safe enough to save her, or would it kill her faster than the cold? The answer to that question would take weeks of labor, 1 Métis freighter, 3 confrontations, and a horse that knew more about the ground than anyone who walked on 2 legs. Have you ever seen the thing that might save you and had everyone around you call it foolish? Tell us in the comments, because Marit's discovery was about to become the most mocked decision on the Pembina Road. Pike learned about the hole before Marit was ready. She did not know how. She suspected the male rider who had seen her digging from the coulee road, or perhaps Louisa, who would not have meant harm, but who could not keep useful intelligence from circulating in a settlement where information was currency. However it happened, by the following Sunday, Pike knew. He used the information the way he used everything, carefully, publicly, and with the appearance of concern. At the store counter, the same counter where settlers bought nails and flour and signed their names on credit lines that Pike tracked in a ledger with handwriting as precise as a surveyor's, Pike mentioned to 3 men and to Leif Assen's eldest son that Marit Brecka had taken to mining ghosts for firewood. He said it with a smile. He said it the way a man says something he wants repeated. The line spread the way lines do in small settlements, not through malice, but through the simple physics of boredom and proximity. Men at the hitching rail outside the store repeated it. A woman buying salt heard it and mentioned it to her husband at supper. By Wednesday, the story had acquired details that Marit had not provided, that she was digging a cave, that she planned to live underground like a prairie dog, that her mare had more sense than its owner. A boy, Louisa's eldest, though Louisa later denied telling him anything, followed Marit to the site on Thursday morning and sang a verse he had composed or borrowed. Marit in the mole hole, digging down to sleep. Marit in the mole hole, buried 6 feet deep. He sang it from 50 yards away and ran when Marit turned. The gossip was not lethal on its own. Gossip was weather in a small settlement. It came, it blew, it passed if nothing fed it. What made it dangerous was Pike. Pike appeared at the store the following Saturday when Marit came for lamp oil. She had not intended to see him, but lamp oil required the store, and the store required Pike. He was behind the counter. He smiled when she entered. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has set a trap and is watching the animal walk toward it. "I hear you found something interesting," Pike said. "I found old planks. That is all. Old planks covering a pit. On your claim, or near it." He paused. Near it might be a problem. Marit said nothing. She had not surveyed the exact boundary between her claim and open territory. The swale where Sewell had stopped might sit on her 160 acres, or just beyond them. She did not know, and Pike's mention of it told her that he had already considered the question. Pike leaned forward on the counter. "An old trapper pit can be dangerous to a settlement. Children could fall in. Livestock could break through. If it sits on open ground, the town has an interest in sealing it." "It sits on my claim." "Does it? Have you surveyed?" Marit did not answer, because she had not. Pike let the silence do its work. Then he said, "I could offer you $18 for whatever rights you think you have under that snow. Call it a kindness. You have enough to manage without worrying about an old hole that could cave in on you or anyone else." $18. Less than half her debt to him. He would buy the claim-adjacent rights, salvage whatever timber the chamber held, sell the story of an old fort discovery, and leave Marit with nothing but a shorter debt and no fuel. "You cannot burn a rumor," Pike said. Marit looked at him. "Then you should have no trouble leaving it alone." She paid for the lamp oil with coins, not credit. She did not sign anything. She walked out into the cold, where Sewell stood at the rail, with frost on her muzzle and her ears turned toward the sound of Marit's boots. Behind her, Pike folded his hands on the counter and waited. He was a patient man. He had 30 days. She had 1 3/4 cords and a hole in the ground. The community pressure tightened in ways that cost time more than pride. The church women who had sent mending work to Marit after Ole's death, seams to repair, quilts to patch, buttons to replace, work that paid in flour and eggs, stopped sending it, not all at once, not with explanation. The baskets simply did not arrive. Marit discovered the absence on Tuesday when she expected the Halverson mending and found the nail where the basket hung empty. The livery in town refused to stable Sol without payment in advance. The liveryman said it was new policy, applied to everyone, but Marit had seen Tollef's horses stabled on account just the week before. These were not organized cruelties. They were the natural consequences of a community deciding, without a meeting or a vote, that Marit Brecke had moved from the category of widow we should help to the category of woman making strange choices we do not need to support. The shift was subtle, but its effects were material. Every lost basket of mending was food she would not have. Every refused service was time spent solving problems that should have been simple. Marit absorbed it. She absorbed it because answering cost time, and time was the one resource more scarce than wood. Every hour spent explaining herself to doubters was an hour not spent clearing the chamber, testing the vents, or measuring the wood. The calendar did not care about her reputation. December was coming, and December did not gossip. She had one ally, though Louisa would not have used that word. Louisa did not laugh. Louisa did not mock. Louisa also did not help, not yet, because Louisa was a practical woman, and the chamber was still a hole that might kill whoever trusted it. But Louisa warned Marit quietly during a brief meeting at the Cooley Crossing. People are already deciding you are unfit to manage a claim alone. Pike is helping them decide. Marit heard the warning. She understood its shape. Pike's angle was public safety. The old pit is hazard, children at risk, livestock endangered mine. But his purpose was private. If the community decided the pit was dangerous, they could petition to have it sealed. If it was sealed, the wood inside was inaccessible. If the wood was inaccessible, Marit had no fuel. If she had no fuel, she could not winter on the claim. If she could not winter, Pike would be waiting with his ledger and his patient smile. The chain was clear. Every link led to the same place. And every day Marit spent digging instead of explaining was another day Pike could add to the public case against her. She dug anyway. The work of opening the chamber properly began in the last week of November. Snow had fallen twice since the discovery, each time covering her cleared section and forcing her to dig down again before she could reach the planks. The temperature had dropped into single digits during the night, and the days were short enough that she had perhaps 6 hours of working light. She started with the entrance. The original hatch, 6 feet by 4 feet of oak planks on cross beams, needed to be fully cleared, reinforced, and fitted with a way to open and close it from above and below. She pulled nails from the shack's scrap pile. She cut new cross supports from the straightest cottonwood she had. She rigged a hinge system from harness leather and iron pins salvaged from Ole's broken sled. The first morning she broke through the surface crust and lowered herself on the rope ladder. The chamber was as she had left it, dry, dark, still. The air smelled the same: old smoke, wood dust, cold clay. The temperature, even without a fire, felt warmer than the air above. She could not measure it precisely, but she held her bare hand against the clay wall and felt the difference. The wall was cool, not cold. The earth's own heat, banked by 20 feet of soil and clay, held a temperature that the December wind could not touch. She spent that first proper working day mapping the chamber by lantern light. The main room, 26 by 14, the lower bay, extending another 11 feet down with its reinforced walls. The wood stack along the west wall, dense and deep. She found, at the far end of the main room, a passage that narrowed to a crawl space and turned toward what she guessed was the south, toward the coulee rim. She did not follow it. Not yet. One problem at a time. She found the first vent on the second day. A square shaft, roughly 8 inches across, running from the ceiling of the main chamber upward through packed earth to a surface opening concealed beneath a dead willow clump. The shaft was partially blocked with debris, leaves, dirt, a bird's nest compressed into a plug of sticks and feathers. But when she cleared it with a stick, cold air rushed down and the lantern flame bent sideways. Air was moving. The chamber breathed. On the third day, she found the second vent on the opposite end, lower, masked by brush and snow. This one was the intake. Cold air entered here, warmed as it passed through the earth temperature space and rose toward the exhaust vent at the high end. The system was crude but functional. Someone decades ago had understood that a buried room needed airflow to remain safe, and had built the vents at different heights to create natural draft. The wood stack required testing. Marit pulled pieces from the outer rows and examined them. The outermost splits, the ones that had sat closest to the clay walls, were soft at the edges. Moisture had crept in over years, softening the sapwood and darkening the grain. These would burn, but poorly. She set them aside. The inner rows were different. Protected by the outer layer, sealed from rain and surface water by the roof and the earth above, the inner hardwood had dried slowly over what looked like decades. When she struck the end grain with the back of the axe, it rang. When she held a split to her nose, she smelled nothing but dry wood. When she pressed her thumbnail into the surface, it did not give. This was the wood that mattered. Dense, dry, seasoned by time and stillness into fuel that would burn slow, burn hot, and leave a coal bed that held heat for hours. 4 cords of it, at least, stacked deep against the wall. But the chamber itself was the real discovery. Not the wood, the earth. The walls held warmth that the shack could not hold. The air moved but did not howl. The temperature below stayed above freezing even when the surface dropped to 15 below. If she could get the stove down, if she could vent the smoke, if she could seal the entrance against blowing snow, the chamber was not just a fuel supply, it was a shelter. And that was the question she could not answer alone. Could one woman in 3 weeks turn a buried fur trade cache into a space where a human being could survive a Dakota winter? Outside, the sky pressed lower. Sol stood at the picket, her breath rising in slow clouds. The first real storm was 10 days out, maybe less. Marit could feel it the way the mare could feel unsound ground, not in the mind, but in the body, in the way the air tasted thinner and the horizon sharpened before it blurred. She climbed out of the chamber, replaced the planks, and stood in the wind. She had found the room, she had found the wood, she had found the air. What she had not found was someone who knew how to make it work. That person was 4 days away, riding a raw-boned mule along the Pembina cart trace with a broken harness over his shoulder and the accumulated knowledge of 64 years of northern winters in his hands. Baptiste Robideau came down the Pembina cart trace on the first day of December, riding a mule the color of wet clay and carrying a harness that had broken somewhere south of the river crossing. He was 64 years old, Métis, son of a French-Canadian winterer and an Ojibwe mother, and he had spent 40 years moving goods between the Red River settlements and St. Paul by cart, by sled, by mule, and when necessary, by the strength of his own back. He was not tall. His hands were thick and scarred across the knuckles from decades of rope, leather, and iron. His face was dark from wind and sun, creased at the eyes the way faces crease when a person has spent most of their life squinting into weather. He did not come to help Marit. He came because Sol threw a shoe near the old cart trace, and the sound of a horse striking bare hoof against frozen ground carried far in cold air. Baptiste heard it from the river road. He turned his mule and followed the sound because a lame horse in December meant trouble for whoever depended on it. He found Marit kneeling beside Sol's left foreleg, holding the hoof between her knees and trying to fit the thrown shoe back onto the wall with a nail and a flat stone. The shoe was bent. The nail was too short. Sol stood with her weight shifted off the bare hoof, patient but in pain. Baptiste watched from 20 yards before he spoke. He saw the rope marks around the planks, 3 ropes tied off to different anchor points, radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. He saw the cleared snow, the pried boards, the dark opening where the entrance hatch had been partially lifted. He saw the woman working on the horse's foot with tools that were wrong for the job, but applied with enough care to show she understood what she was trying to do. "Why did you tie off to 3 directions?" he asked. Marit looked up. She had not heard him approach. She studied his face, his mule, his broken harness, and the way he was looking not at her but at the ropes. "Because if the ground sinks, I want warning from whichever side goes first," she said. Baptiste nodded. It was a small thing, the 3-point tie-off, but it told him something that mattered. This woman thought about what could go wrong before she stepped forward. She listened to the ground. She had tied ropes because she did not trust planks that looked solid. Most people trusted what looked solid. Most people fell through. "The shoe is bent at the toe clip," Baptiste said. "You cannot cold set it with a stone. You need a hard edge and heat." "I have no forge." "You have a stove." He said it simply, the way a man states a fact he considers obvious, and in that single exchange, a thrown shoe, a bent clip, a stove standing in a shack 2 miles east, the relationship between Baptiste Robidoux and Marie Brecka began. He fixed Sol's shoe that afternoon. He heated the clip on Marit's cracked stove, hammered it against Ole's anvil stone, and set it with nails he pulled from his own saddlebag. He worked without hurrying and without talking. When the shoe was set and Sol put weight on it without flinching, he looked at the rope-lace planks and said, "Who built a cache this far from the river?" "I do not know. I found it last week." "Have you been inside?" "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." Baptiste looked at her the way Tolef had looked at her, but the conclusion was different. Tolef had seen a woman who could not survive. Baptiste saw a woman who had gone underground alone and come back up, which meant she had tested the air, measured the drop, and chosen to climb rather than fall. He did not say this. He said, "Show me." They descended together. Baptiste went first. He moved through the entrance hatch with the ease of a man who had spent decades entering spaces others avoided. Fur trade caches, riverbank storage pits, winter lodges dug into cut banks. He held the lantern low and swept it across the walls, the posts, the cross braces, and the packed clay floor. He touched the oak shoring with his palm. He pressed a thumbnail into the tamarack braces. He looked at the ceiling, the underside of the planked roof, and tested each board with his fingers. "Cartmen built this," he said. "Métis, maybe, or company men before them. The shelf pegs are willow lashed, not nailed. That is old work, old and careful." He found details Marit had missed, French chalk marks on the south wall, faded numbers, and a symbol she did not recognize. Iron pins reused as shelf brackets, forged with a curve that Baptiste said was a cart pin shape, designed to hold the axle of a Red River cart. A willow-lashed brace at the junction of the main chamber and the lower bay, woven in a pattern that Baptiste traced with his finger. "This was not a trap pit," Baptiste said. "This was a supply cache, winter storage for a brigade. They packed it for a return trip and never came back." "Why?" "Smallpox, fire, a route change, competition. Men disappeared from this country for many reasons." He looked at the wood stack. but they left their fuel. He pulled a split from the inner row and held it to the lantern. Hickory. He struck it against the wall and listened to the ring. Then he pulled a second piece. Bur oak, a third, white oak. He examined the grain, the end checks, the color of the heartwood. How old? Marit asked. 40 years, maybe 50. It has been sealed a long time. The outer rows took moisture from the walls, but the inner wood is sound. Better than sound, it dried slow. Wood that dries slow burns slow. He held the hickory split in both hands. This is better fuel than anything you will find on the surface within 20 miles. Marit felt the words land in her chest the way Tolef's verdict had landed, but in reverse. Tolef had said she would not make it to January. Baptiste was holding wood that could carry her past January and into March. Can the chamber hold a fire? She asked. Not yet. Not safely. He pointed at the ceiling, where the old planks showed dark stains along the joins. Smoke in a sealed room kills faster than cold. You need draft, controlled draft, air in at the bottom, smoke out at the top, and enough distance between the fire and the wood stack that a spark does not turn this cache into a funeral. I found 2 vents. Baptiste looked at her sharply. You found them or you cleared them? Found them. Partially cleared one. Show me. This was the first teaching. Baptiste called it reading old ground, though he did not name it formally. He simply began showing Mari things she had not known to look for. They climbed out and walked the surface above the chamber. Baptiste moved slowly, probing the snow with a sharpened willow rod he cut from the dead clump near the exhaust vent. He showed her how snow packs differently over hollow space, firmer where earth supports it, softer where a void beneath allows settling. He showed her the glazed crust around the exhaust vent opening, where warm air from below had melted and refrozen the surface snow into a glass-hard shell. He showed her how to read the pattern. Ice ring means vent below. Soft snow means weak roof. Firm snow means solid earth. He found a third opening she had missed entirely, a narrow drainage channel that ran from the lowest point of the lower bay southward toward the coulee, designed to carry groundwater away from the storage floor. The channel was blocked with decades of silt and frozen debris, but its existence meant the builders had understood the fundamental problem of underground storage: water. A cache that flooded was worse than no cache at all. Before you put fire underground, Baptiste said, you put air underground. Before you put air underground, you put drainage underground. Water, then air, then fire, in that order. He did not say this as a lecture. He said it while crouching beside the drainage channel with his hands in the snow, pulling frozen mud from the opening with his fingers. The lesson came through the work, not above it. They spent the rest of that day clearing vents. The exhaust shaft, the high vent hidden in the willow clump, was partially blocked with the compressed bird's nest and years of leaf debris. Baptiste climbed the willow and worked a pole down through the shaft from above, while Marie stood below with the lantern and called up when the obstruction shifted. The debris fell in a cascade of dry sticks, feathers, and dust that made her cough and step back. When the shaft was clear, cold air poured down from above, and the lantern flame in the main chamber leaned toward the intake vent and steadied. Good, Baptiste said from above. The air knows where to go. We just need to keep the path open. He showed her how to cap the vents with angled boards, slanted pieces set over the opening so that drifting snow would slide off rather than pile into the shaft. The caps were simple: 2 boards nailed at an angle with gaps at the lower edges for air passage. They could be checked from the surface without entering the chamber. Snow wants to seal everything, Baptiste said. Your job is to give the vents a shape that snow cannot fill. Angle defeats drift. Flat invites burial. By the time the light failed, they had cleared both vent shafts, capped them, and tested the draft by lighting a smoking rag in the lower bay and watching the smoke travel from the intake side to the exhaust side in a slow, steady current. The chamber breathed, not fast, not strong, but it breathed. Baptiste stayed the night in Marie's shack, sleeping on the floor beside the stove with his mule tied to the picket alongside Soul. He did not explain why he stayed, and Marie did not ask, because the explanation was the weather. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since morning, and the road was no place for a man on a mule after dark. In the morning, he did not leave. He looked at the shack, at the cracked stove, at the thin walls, and at the cottonwood pile that had shrunk visibly since Marit began burning it for warmth during the nights she could not spend underground. He looked at all of it with the eyes of a man making a calculation that had nothing to do with money. "You need help," he said, not as charity, not as pity, as fact. "I cannot pay." "I did not ask for payment. I asked for bread. You have flour. I have time. Bread for labor is trade, not charity." Marit baked bread that morning. Baptiste ate half a loaf with coffee so weak it was barely brown. Then they walked to the cache together. The second teaching was air before fire. Baptiste insisted on 3 days of vent work before he would allow Marit to move the stove. 3 days felt like 3 weeks. The temperature dropped further each night. The cottonwood pile shrank. Marit burned splits in the shack stove and calculated the rate. At the current pace, she had 12 days of cottonwood left. 12 days before the shack went cold entirely. Baptiste did not hurry. He tested and retested the airflow. He lowered a candle to the floor of the lower bay and watched the flame. He lowered a lantern and timed how long the oil burned before the flame changed character. He lit a smoking rag and held it at 5 different positions in the chamber, mapping the draft pattern by the direction of the smoke. He found that the air moved fastest near the floor and slowest at ceiling height, which meant the vents were creating a low-intake, high-exhaust circulation. Exactly the pattern needed to clear smoke from a fire without stealing all the heat. "Cold air is heavy," he said. "It falls. It enters at the low vent, crosses the floor, picks up heat from the fire, rises, and leaves through the high vent. If you block the low vent, the fire chokes. If you block the high vent, the smoke stays. If you block both, you die." He looked at Marit. "You must check the vents before you sleep and after you wake. Every time. No exceptions. And if they are blocked, then you go above. You do not try to clear them from inside. Smoke tells you faster than prayer. If the smoke changes direction, the vent is closing. Go up." On the 4th day, they moved the stove. This was the most physically brutal work Marit had done since Old's burial. The cracked stove weighed more than she could carry alone. Baptiste rigged a sling from rope and harness leather, and they lowered it through the entrance hatch on a makeshift pulley looped over a cross beam. The stove swung and banged against the walls. The rope slipped twice. On the second slip, the stove dropped 2 feet and struck the ladder, cracking a rung and sending a shower of dried clay down onto Marit's head. They set the stove in the lower bay on a hearth Baptiste built from flat stones hauled up from the coulee bed and mortared with clay. The hearth was simple but critical. Stone beneath the stove to protect the clay floor, stone behind the stove to reflect heat forward, and a gap between the stone and the wood stack, wide enough that no spark could bridge it. The stovepipe presented the hardest problem. Smoke had to travel from the stove upward through the exhaust shaft and out into open air. The original exhaust vent was 8 inches square, wide enough for natural draft but not designed for a pipe. Baptiste used salvaged tin from Marit's scrap pile, cutting and bending it into sections that telescoped from the stove collar to the vent shaft. He packed the joints with wet clay, that would harden in the heat. He wired each section to the next with twisted fence wire. The fit was imperfect. Smoke leaked at the joins where the tin did not seat flush. Baptiste taught Marit to seal the leaks with additional clay, applied wet and smoothed with a stick while the pipe was warm but not hot. "Clay likes heat," he said. "It tightens when it dries. Give it 3 fires and it will grip the tin." On the 5th day, they lit the first fire underground. Marit used the driest cottonwood she had, small splits, thumb thick, arranged in a loose stack on the stone hearth. She opened both vents. She lit the tinder with a match and stepped back. The smoke rose. It curled upward from the stove, entered the pipe, traveled through the joins, leaking at 2 spots where the clay was still wet, and climbed the exhaust shaft. Outside, Baptiste stood at the vent cap and watched. A thin stream of gray smoke rose from the willow clump and bent north in the wind. Inside, Marit stood in the lower bay and breathed. The air tasted of smoke. Light, wood-flavored, not choking. The draft was pulling, the fire was drawing. The stove, cracked and battered and bought on credit from Pike's store, was doing what it had always done. Only now it was doing it in a room where the heat had nowhere to go but into clay walls that would hold it and give it back slowly. She fed the fire, small splits, then larger ones. Then, for the first time, she placed a piece of the cache's hickory into the stove. It caught slowly. Hickory does not flare. It accepts flame the way stone accepts rain, gradually, without hurry. The wood darkened, cracked along the grain, and began to glow. The heat was different from cottonwood heat, denser, steadier. The stove's iron sides warmed evenly, without the hot spots and cold patches that cottonwood produced. The fire settled into a rhythm that Marit could feel through the soles of her boots, a low, constant pulse of heat that did not spike and did not fade. Baptiste descended and stood beside her. He held his palm 6 inches from the stove. He held it against the clay wall behind the hearth. He checked the vent caps from inside, looking up the shafts for light. "How long will this wood last?" Marit asked. "If you burn small and bank the coals, a cord of this hickory will outlast 2 cords of your cottonwood, maybe more. The denser the wood, the longer the coal bed. The longer the coal bed, the less you burn overnight." Marit calculated. 4 cords of dense hardwood at double the efficiency of cottonwood meant the equivalent of 8 cords of cottonwood heat. Add her remaining cottonwood, roughly 1 1/4 cords after what she had already burned, and she had the thermal equivalent of 10 cords. Tolif Asen had said she needed 6 cords of real hardwood for a tight cabin. The cabin was not tight, but the chamber was better than tight. The chamber was earth. For the first time since Ole died, the math worked. The progress over the next 2 weeks came in measured stages. Each one fought against weather, fatigue, and the steady depletion of Marit's above-ground resources. Days 6 through 8, they sorted the wood stack. Every piece in the outer rows was pulled, inspected, and graded. Punky splits went to a separate pile for kindling. They would burn fast but serve to start fires that the dense inner wood would sustain. Sound splits were restacked on the raised rails, bark side up, with air gaps maintained between rows. Baptiste showed Marit how to test wood by sound. A clear ring meant dry and dense. A dull thud meant moisture or rot. They counted. The accessible supply in the lower bay came to 4 1/4 cords of sound hardwood, plus nearly a cord of punky outer wood suitable for kindling and quick heat. Days 9 and 10. They repaired the ladder. The original rope ladder was too fragile for daily use with loads. Baptiste cut new rungs from oak scraps in the cache and lashed them with rawhide strips. He set the ladder at an angle against the entrance wall, rather than hanging it vertically, which made climbing with full hands possible. Marit could now carry a bucket or sack up and down without needing a free hand for the rope. Day 11. They banked the hatch with sod and snow. The entrance, when open, admitted wind that disrupted the vent draft and chilled the chamber. Baptiste designed a double cover system, an inner hatch of planks that could be sealed from below, and an outer layer of sod blocks packed with snow that insulated the opening against surface cold. When both covers were in place, the entrance disappeared into the landscape. From 20 yards away, the site looked like unmarked snow. Marit's body tracked the cost. Her knuckles split from cold and clay work. A bruise spread across her left shoulder where the stove rope had slipped. She coughed, a dry, persistent cough from breathing cold air during the surface work and smoky air during the fire tests. She ate less than she should have because the flour was running low, and the beans were reserved for days when the work was heaviest. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her wrists, always thin, became ridged with tendon. Sol bore her own costs. The mare's left fetlock swelled from the cold and the uneven footing around the dig site. Marit wrapped it with flannel strips torn from a petticoat, tying them tight enough to support, but not to bind. Sul accepted the wrapping the way she accepted everything, with patience, lowered head, and slow blinks. Setbacks arrived on schedule. On day 9, a horizontal brace in the main chamber cracked under the weight of snow that had accumulated on the roof section above it. The crack was loud. A rifle shot in the enclosed space, and Marit and Baptiste both stopped breathing for a full second before they realized the brace had split but not failed. They replaced it with a doubled oak beam, cut from one of the punky outer logs and wedged into place with stone shims. It held, but the crack remained as a reminder that the structure was old, and old things failed without announcement. On day 13, Pike brought Tolef Asen to inspect the site. They arrived without warning on horseback and stood at the edge of the cleared area while Marit was below sorting wood. She heard hooves and climbed the ladder to find Pike pointing at the hatch, and Tolef standing with his arms crossed and his mouth set in the thin line that meant he was forming a judgment. "You should not be here without my permission," Marit said to Pike. "I came as a neighbor, not a creditor. Tolef wanted to see." Tolef said nothing for a moment. Then he walked to the hatch, knelt, and looked down into the chamber. He studied the walls, the braces, the stovepipe running up the exhaust shaft. He descended without asking permission, which was his way. Tolef did not ask for things he considered within his rights as a man of experience. Below, he touched the clay walls. He tested the braces. He examined the stove hearth. He pulled a split of hickory from the stack and struck it against the wall. It rang. He climbed back up and stood in the snow. His face held something Marit had not seen before, not approval, but confusion. The wood was real. The chamber was sound. The vents worked. The stove drew. Everything he saw contradicted what he believed, and Tolef Asen was not a man who enjoyed being contradicted. "A cellar is not a winter," Tolef said. Marit said nothing. She picked up a piece of hickory from the sorted pile, struck flint against steel, and held the spark to a shaving curled from the split's edge. The shaving caught. The flame licked upward, blue at the base and yellow at the tip. The hickory darkened, cracked, and began to glow with the steady heat that cottonwood could never produce. Tolef watched the flame. He did not speak again. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode south. Pike watched him go, then looked at Marit with an expression she could not read, not anger, not amusement, something closer to recalculation. "You still owe $43.08. Pike said. I know what I owe. Pike rode after Tolliff. Marit stood in the snow with a burning piece of hickory in her hand and the taste of smoke on her tongue. The wood burned. The earth held warmth. The vents breathed. But Tolliff had not said she was right. He had said a cellar was not a winter, and winter had not yet arrived to prove which of them understood it better. By the first week of January, Marit had 2 shelters and a fragile system connecting them. The shack above, 12 by 16 feet, chinking improved with mud and grass. Roof corner weighted with stones, but still cold, still drafty, still burning cottonwood at a rate that left the pile visibly smaller each morning. The chamber below, stove burning, vents capped, wood stacked, ladder solid, temperature holding above 40 degrees near the storage wall and above 50 degrees near the stove corner when the fire was fed. She tested the numbers with 2 thermometers, one she had taken from Pike's store on credit she would regret, and one borrowed from Louisa, who offered it the way she offered everything, with the words, "Bring it back," instead of "Good luck." The difference was measurable. On a night when the surface air dropped to 10 degrees below zero, the shack's interior fell to near freezing within 3 hours of the stove dying. In the chamber, with embers banked and the vents capped to half open, the temperature at the storage wall held at 42 degrees. At the stove corner, it held at 51. The earth was doing what her father had told her it would do years ago in Norway, with his hand pressed against stone and his voice calm with the certainty of someone who had never needed to prove what he knew because the stone proved it every winter. Louisa came to see. She descended the ladder with the reluctance of a woman who trusts floors and distrusts holes, and she stood in the lower bay with her arms wrapped around herself and her eyes moving from the stove to the walls, to the wood stack, to the vents. "It is warm," Louisa said. The surprise in her voice was not theatrical. It was the genuine surprise of a practical woman encountering a fact that her practicality had not predicted. 42 degrees at the wall, 51 at the stove. "That is warmer than my house at night." "I know." Louisa looked at the vent shafts, the capped openings, the stovepipe running upward through clay-packed tin. She asked the question that mattered most. "Can you reach this in a whiteout?" Marit did not have an answer. The chamber was 2 miles from the shack. In a blizzard, real blizzard, Dakota blizzard, the kind where snow moves sideways and the world turns white at arm's length, 2 miles was 2 miles too far. She could wander past the entrance in blowing snow and die within 50 feet of safety. Baptiste had taught her the rope system before he left. A line from the shack door to a post at the halfway point, a second line from the post to the hatch, a third line from the hatch to the vent marker and the horse picket, knotted every 10 feet so she could measure distance by touch. In total darkness, in wind that erased direction, the rope was the only navigation that worked. Hands on the line, count the knots, follow the direction, trust the rope. Louisa tested a section of the rope. She pulled it, felt the knots, counted. And if the rope breaks, it will not break. It is double-twisted harness line. Everything breaks. Then I follow Sol. She knows the ground. Louisa looked at her. The doubt had not vanished, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the doubt of someone who thought Marit was foolish. It was the doubt of someone who thought Marit might be right, but who understood with the clarity of a mother of 3 that being right and being safe were not the same thing. She left with the thermometer and a promise to return if conditions worsened. She did not say, "Be careful," this time. She said, "Keep the rope tight." Baptiste left on the 8th of January. He had to ride toward St. Joseph, the settlement that would later be called Walhalla, to deliver medicine to a cousin whose family had been sick since November. He packed his mule in the gray morning light and stood beside Saul's picket for a long time, rubbing the mare's muzzle with his scarred hand. He gave Marit 3 instructions. Keep the vents clear. Trust Saul's refusal. Never open the hatch wide in blowing snow. Why not wide? Because wind will enter and break the draft. The smoke will reverse. You will not see it reverse because the snow blinds you, and you will not smell it reverse because the cold numbs your nose. You will only know when your eyes burn and your head swims. Open the hatch narrow. Always narrow. He mounted the mule. He looked at the flat white landscape, the coulee line, the willow clump that marked the exhaust vent. He looked at Marit. You listen to that horse, he said. She is older than your doubt. He rode north. Marit watched until the mule became a dark mark against the snow, and then a smudge, and then nothing. The wind erased his track within the hour. She was alone. Pike watched Baptiste leave. She did not see Pike, but she learned later that he had been at the coulee crossing that morning, checking on a debtor's cattle herd, and had seen the mule heading north. Pike noted the direction, the time, and the fact that Marit's only ally was now a day's ride away and moving farther. The morning of January 12th, 1888, began with a lie. The air was mild, warmer than it had any right to be in deep January on the northern plains. Snow softened under Saul's hooves. Water dripped from the shack's roof edge. Marit loosened her scarf and felt sun on her throat for the first time in weeks. The warmth was dangerous because it made people careless. Across the territory, settlers stepped outside without coats. Children walked to school in light wraps. Teachers opened windows. Farmers drove wagons to distant claims. The mild morning was an invitation, and invitations in Dakota winter were traps. Marit made the dangerous choice. Louisa's youngest daughter, Clara, had been feverish for 3 days. Louisa had sent word through her eldest boy that the fever was worsening and their flour was gone. Marit loaded mending and a sack of beans onto the sled and drove Sol toward the Meacham place 3 miles east. She arrived at mid-morning. Clara was 4 years old, hot-skinned and limp, breathing through her mouth. Louisa's face held the hollow look of a mother who has not slept in days. The other children sat quiet in the corner, watching their sister with the focused attention of children who sense that something is wrong and cannot name it. Louisa said, "I need her closer to town. The fever is not breaking. The road to town is 12 miles. It is the only road." Marit looked at Clara. She looked at Louisa. She made the decision that would nearly kill them both and save them both. "I will take her. My sled is faster than your wagon. I can reach the church crossing by afternoon." They bundled Clara in quilts and blankets and placed her in the sled bed. Louisa kissed the child's forehead and said nothing, because the things she wanted to say, "Come back, be safe, do not let her die," were too large for words and too obvious for speech. Marit drove Sol back toward the main road. The mild air held. The sky was clear to the south and hazy to the northwest, a haze that Marit noted but did not fear because the warmth seemed to contradict it. Warm air meant no blizzard. That was the logic. The logic was wrong. The storm arrived at 1:30. It did not build. It did not approach with the slow darkening that most storms use as warning. It struck. The northwestern sky, hazy an hour before, turned the color of a bruise and then the color of nothing, a wall of white that moved across the prairie faster than a horse could run. The wind hit first, a horizontal blast that rocked the sled sideways and tore the scarf from Marit's neck. Then the snow came, not falling, but driving, particles so fine and so dense that the air itself turned solid. Within minutes, Marit could not see Saul's ears. The temperature dropped so fast that the moisture in the mild air froze on every surface. The sled runners seized, Saul's mane caked with ice. Marit's eyelashes froze together, and she had to claw them apart with her fingers to see the nothing that surrounded her. Clara screamed once, a thin sound swallowed by the wind, and then went silent under the blankets. Marit reached back and pressed her hand against the quilts. The child was there, breathing, hot with fever, but alive. Saul panicked. The mare lunged forward, then sideways, then tried to turn. The sled fishtailed across the road. If there was still a road, direction had vanished with the horizon. Marit hauled on the reins and spoke, not words but sounds, the low, steady tones that Ole had used with the horse in Thunder. Saul slowed. She stood heaving, her sides coated in white, her hooves planted. The wind screamed past them in sheets. Marit could not see the road. She could not see the sky. She could not see the ground beyond 3 feet. She was somewhere between Louisa's place and her own claim, perhaps 2 miles from either, perhaps more, in a blizzard that was killing people across 400 miles of open prairie. She made the choice that the title describes. She urged Saul forward toward what she believed was west, toward the claim, toward the chamber. Saul took 3 steps and stopped. She planted her front hooves and refused. Marit pulled. Saul did not move. Marit dismounted into snow that was already knee-deep and grabbed the bridle. She pulled. Saul swung her head sideways, nearly lifting Marit off her feet, and stamped. Not at the ground, at what was beneath the ground. The hollow thump came up through the snow. Marit froze. She knew that sound. She had heard it weeks ago, on the day she found the cache, when Saul's hoof had struck the hidden roof and the mare had refused to cross. This was the same sound, but they were not near the main entrance. They were somewhere else, south of the hatch, near the coulee rim where the chamber's side passage ran toward the drainage channel. If you have been holding your breath through this storm, stay with us, because the next 60 seconds will decide whether the chamber becomes a shelter or a coffin. Marit dropped to her knees. She brushed snow with her bare hands. The mittens were gone, stripped by wind, and felt the edge of a plank. Old wood, square cut. She pulled the axe from the sled and struck. The plank cracked. She struck again. The plank split and fell inward, and warm air rose through the gap. Warm compared to the wind, warm enough to feel against her frozen face like a breath from an open mouth. She had found the secondary entrance, the old side passage, half collapsed but not sealed. The air from her banked fire, still alive in the lower bay, was pushing upward through the gaps. She worked fast and badly. She widened the hole with the axe, swinging in wind that tried to take the handle from her grip. She cleared enough space for a body to pass through. She could not see the bottom. The lantern was in the sled, and the sled was behind Saul, and Saul was a shape in the white that she located only by keeping one hand on the harness rope. She carried Clara first. The child weighed almost nothing, bundled in quilts, limp with fever. Marit lowered her through the broken opening on a loop of rope, feeding the line through her cracked hands until the weight went slack, and she felt the bundle touch something solid. She heard Clara cough. The cough echoed in enclosed space. The child was inside. She went back for supplies, the bean sack, a quilt, the matches in her coat pocket. She left the sled. It could not follow her underground. Saul she could not leave. The mare would not fit through the side entrance. The hole was too narrow, the passage too low. But Saul could not stand in a blizzard for hours without shelter. Merritt remembered the main hatch, 200 yards north, give or take, along the rope line she had strung from vent to vent. She tied a rope to Sol's halter and looped the other end around her own waist. She walked north into the blizzard, counting steps, dragging her free hand through the snow at ground level, searching for the line. She found it after 47 steps, the knotted harness rope buried under 3 inches of new snow, but still taut between its anchor points. She followed it, knot by knot, toward the main hatch. The hatch was buried. Snow had drifted over the sod cover and packed it into a mound indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. Merritt found it by feel, the square edge of the outer frame, the slight depression where the sod blocks met. She cleared it with the axe in her hands. Her fingers bled. She did not feel them. She opened the inner hatch, narrow, as Baptiste had warned, not wide, and led Sol to the upper bay where the passage widened enough for a horse to stand. Sol descended the ramp that Baptiste had cut into the entrance slope weeks ago, her hooves slipping on frozen clay, her breath enormous in the enclosed space. Marit tied her to a post in the upper bay, threw the sled blanket over her back, and scrambled down the ladder to the lower bay. Clara was on the floor where the rope had lowered her, still bundled, still breathing, still burning with fever. The stove was cold. The embers Marit had banked that morning were gray but not dead. She blew on them. She fed shavings. She fed cottonwood kindling. She fed a split of hickory. The fire came back slowly, then with conviction. The stove's iron warmed. The air in the lower bay, already above freezing from the earth's steady temperature, began to rise toward the 50-degree mark that Marit had recorded on the good days. But the vents were half choked. Snow had packed into the exhaust shaft during the storm's first hour, and the draft was weak. Smoke curled from the stove joins and hung in a layer at chest height, acrid and thickening. Marit's eyes burned. Clara coughed again, a wet, deep cough that could have been the fever or the smoke or both. Marit had to choose. Stay below with the child and risk smoke filling the chamber, or climb into the blizzard and clear the exhaust vent by feel. She climbed. The surface was worse than before. The wind had not diminished. The snow was denser. She found the exhaust vent by following the rope line to the willow clump, counting knots, 7 from the hatch, the 8th knot at the vent marker. She reached into the shaft and pulled snow and ice with her bare hands. The blockage was deep, 8 inches of packed snow compressed by wind into a plug that resisted her fingers. She used a stick. She used the axe handle. She punched through, and the draft resumed with a sound she could hear even over the wind. A low moan as air began to move again through the shaft. She returned below. The smoke was clearing. The draft pulled it upward and out. Clara's coughing eased. Marit wrapped the child in every blanket and quilt she had, laid her near the stove on a bed of dried grass and sacking, and sat on the clay floor with her back against the wall and her hands pressed between her knees to stop the bleeding. Above, the blizzard raged. The children's blizzard, though no one called it that yet, was killing people across the Dakotas, across Nebraska, across Minnesota and Iowa. A school teacher in a settlement south of the Pembina Road tied her students together with clothesline and led them toward a farmhouse she could not see, counting steps and praying she had the direction right. Tolif Asen tried to reach his neighbor's barn and turned back with ice in his beard and blood in his cough. Pike's hired man lost a team of horses in a drift 1/2 mile from the store. An unnamed settler was found 3 days later within 40 rods of his own barn, frozen in a walking posture, his hand reaching for a gate he had passed in the white. Below ground, in a chamber built by men whose names had been forgotten, Marit Brecka sat with a sick child and a horse and a fire that burned on 50-year-old hickory and listened to the wind try to find a way in. The wind could not find a way in. The earth held. After 6 hours, Clara's shivering slowed. Marit checked the child's forehead. Still hot, but the heat was steady now, not climbing. The chamber's warmth was not medicine, but it was keeping the child's body from spending energy on both fever and cold. After one day, the snow sealed the upper hatch completely. Marit could not open it from below. The exit was gone, but the vents still breathed. She checked them every 3 hours, climbing the ladder to the upper bay, testing the draft by holding a candle near the intake shaft. The flame leaned inward. Air was still moving. The chamber was not sealed. It was buried, but it breathed. She fed the stove small splits of hickory and oak. Never a roaring fire. Small, steady, controlled. The wood's density meant that a single split the size of her forearm burned for 2 hours and left a coal bed that held heat for 2 more. She melted snow in a kettle. Snow collected from the upper bay where it sifted through cracks in the hatch cover. She cooked beans. She fed Clara broth made from beans and the last of the flour. She kept Saul in the upper bay with hay she had dragged from the sled before abandoning it. She marked each day by cutting a notch into a brace post with the axe. 1 notch, 2, 3. The storm itself blew for roughly 36 hours, but the isolation lasted longer. The roads were impassable. The drifts were head-high. Communication failed. The world above was sealed in white, and no one came. On the 4th night, Marit heard a sound above the hatch, a scraping, metal on wood, a shovel. She climbed the ladder and pressed her ear to the inner hatch. She heard a man's voice, muffled by snow and wood, speaking to someone, or to himself. She heard the shovel strike again, then again. The scraping moved along the hatch frame, clearing snow, testing the planks. The voice was Pike's. He was not there to rescue. He had waited 4 days. 4 days before coming to check on the claim. He had come because he believed Marit was dead or gone, frozen somewhere between the Meacham place and the claim, or huddled in the shack with no fuel and no hope. He had come to assess the property, to begin the arithmetic of acquisition. The shovel broke through at the weakest point of the outer cover, the north corner where the sod had been packed loosely. Cold air and light flooded in. Marit squinted upward and saw Pike's face framed by the hole, ruddy with cold, squinting downward into the dark. Then Sewell screamed. The mare, tied in the upper bay, heard the breach and reacted. Her voice, deep, full-lunged, the scream of a horse that has been underground for 4 days and senses open air, shook the chamber. Pike recoiled. He stepped backward, and the section of rotten roof where he had been standing cracked and sagged. He fell to one knee, scrambled back, and stood on solid ground with his shovel clutched in both hands and his face white. Marit pushed the inner hatch open. She stood in the light and looked at Pike. "I am alive," she said. "The child is alive. The horse is alive. The claim is occupied." Pike said nothing. He looked at the open chamber, the stove smoke rising from the exhaust vent, the horse's eyes gleaming in the upper bay, and Marit standing in the hatch with cracked hands and a face that held no gratitude and no fear. He left without speaking. Marit watched him walk to his horse, mount, and ride toward the coulee road. The sky above was clear. The storm was over. The cold remained. 20 below, maybe colder, but the wind had stopped, and in the silence the chamber's exhaust vent breathed a thin stream of smoke into the still air, marking the spot where the earth had held when the sky had not. Below, Clara slept. The coal bed glowed. In 4 days, Marit had burned less than a quarter cord of hardwood, because earth and still air and dense dry wood did what the shack, with all its gaps and drafts and thin walls, could never do. They held the heat. They kept it. They did not give it back to the wind. Marit descended the ladder and sat beside the stove. She pressed her hands against the warm clay wall and felt her father's lesson. Stone, earth, still air, proven in a place he had never seen by a daughter he would never visit, in a winter that would be remembered for the people it killed and forgotten for the people it did not. She cut the 5th notch into the brace post. Outside, the Pembina road lay buried. Inside, the fire held. The road opened on the 7th day after the storm. Not fully, drifts still blocked the low crossings and the coulee bend, but enough for a horse to pass single file if the rider knew the ground. Louisa's husband, Peter Meacham, was the first to reach the site. He came on foot because his wagon could not clear the drifts, carrying a rifle and a coil of rope, and the expression of a man who expects to find the dead and is preparing himself for the work of carrying them home. Toluf Asen came an hour behind him, riding the same horse he had ridden when he inspected the chamber weeks ago. His face was raw from the cold that had nearly killed him when he tried to reach his neighbor during the storm. His left ear was black at the tip where frostbite had taken it, and he held the reins with hands wrapped in strips of flour sacking because his gloves had been lost in the drift. They expected bodies. They found Marit standing at the open hatch, squinting in the light, with Clara on her hip and Soul's halter in her free hand. The mare climbed the entrance ramp into daylight and stood blinking, her breath steaming, her coat rough from days underground, but her legs sound and her eyes clear. Peter stopped walking. He looked at his daughter, alive, pale, fever-broken but breathing, reaching toward him with one small hand extended from the blanket. He took her. He held her against his chest and pressed his face into the quilts, and stood that way for a long time while the wind moved the snow around his boots. He did not speak to Marit. He did not need to. The child in his arms said everything that words could not. Louisa arrived that afternoon, having walked the 3 miles from her place in snow that reached her thighs. She descended the ladder without hesitation. The same woman who had called the chamber a grave, with steps, now climbed into it as if it were a church. She stood in the lower bay and looked at the stove, the stacked wood, the warm clay walls, the notches Marit had cut into the brace post. 5 notches. 5 days and nights underground with a sick child and a horse and a fire that never died. I called it a grave, Louisa said. It nearly was, Marit said. She did not say this with triumph. She said it with the flat voice of a woman who had cleared a vent shaft in a blizzard with bare hands and was not interested in being congratulated for surviving what should not have been necessary. Louisa touched the clay wall. She felt the warmth, still there, still steady, still held by 20 feet of earth that did not care whether the air above was mild or murderous. How much wood did you burn? Louisa asked. Less than a quarter cord in 5 days. Louisa's face changed. A quarter cord in 5 days, during the worst blizzard in living memory, with a fire burning continuously. Her own house, above ground with tight walls and a good stove and 3 cords of elm, had consumed more than a full cord in the same period and still dropped below freezing when the stove died overnight. The math was not close. The chamber had outperformed every surface dwelling in the settlement by a factor that Louisa could calculate without help. Show me the vents, Louisa said. Toluf Asen descended on the same afternoon. He moved through the chamber the way he had moved through it on his first visit, touching walls, testing braces, examining joints. But this time he was not looking for reasons to doubt. He was looking for reasons it had worked. He inspected the stove hearth. He traced the stovepipe from the collar to the exhaust shaft. He examined the vent caps, the intake shaft, the drainage channel that Baptiste had cleared. He pulled a split of hickory from the stack and weighed it in his hand. He counted the remaining wood. He looked at the notches on the brace. He stood in the lower bay for a long time. The stove was burning low. Marit had let it drop to embers now that the crisis had passed, and the temperature at the wall was 40 degrees. Outside, the surface air was 18 below zero. The difference? 58 degrees of separation between the world above and the world below was held by nothing more than packed earth, clay banking, old oak posts, and the physics that Marit's father had taught her in a stone dairy in Norway. Tollef turned to Marit. He looked older than he had looked 3 weeks ago. The frostbitten ear, the cracked skin, the weight loss from the days when his own stove had failed and his own house had nearly killed him. These marked him in ways that would not heal by spring. "I was wrong," Tollef said. He said it plainly, without softening. "A cellar is not a winter. This one was." He said the word "this" with emphasis, as if drawing a line between the general truth he still believed on, that most cellars, most holes in the ground, most desperate improvisations would fail, and the specific truth he could no longer deny, which was that this particular cellar, this particular woman, this particular combination of old wood, cleared vents, earth insulation, and banked fire had held through the worst storm he had seen in his years on the plains. It was the most Tollef Asen had ever conceded to anyone. Marit heard it and nodded. She did not thank him, because thanks would have diminished what he had given, not praise, but admission, which cost more. Within 2 weeks of the blizzard's end, the settlement reorganized itself around a fact it could not ignore. Marit Brekke's underground chamber had outperformed every surface structure within 20 miles during the worst storm in a generation, and it had done so with less fuel, less heat loss, and less risk than any house, barn, or dugout in the territory. People came, not all at once, and not all willingly. Some came because Louisa told them. Some came because Tollef, whose authority in matters of winter survival was unquestioned, told them that what he had seen underground was worth seeing. Some came because their own houses had nearly killed them during the blizzard, and they were desperate enough to listen to a 23-year-old widow who had survived where they had almost failed. Marit did not turn anyone away. She also did not perform. She showed them the chamber the way she had learned it, methodically, practically, without embellishment. She showed them the vents and explained the draft. She showed them the stove hearth and explained why stone beneath and behind the firebox mattered. She showed them the wood stack and explained the difference between wood that rang when struck and wood that thudded. She showed them the raised rails and explained why 3 inches of air between the floor and the fuel prevented moisture from wicking upward into dry wood. She showed them the rope line and explained the knots. A widow named Astrid Flatten, whose husband had frozen to death within sight of their own barn during the blizzard, stood at the hatch and wept. Not for herself, for the rope. 10 feet between knots, a line strung between door and barn, would have saved her husband's life. He had died because he could not find a building he had walked to 1,000 times, because the snow erased direction and the wind erased distance, and a man who knew his own land by sight became a stranger in his own yard. Marit did not comfort Astrid with words. She gave her a length of rope and showed her how to tie the knots by feel. The school teacher came, the same teacher who had tied her students together with clothesline during the blizzard and led them to safety by counting steps. Her name was Ragna Solheim. She was 26, thin-faced, precise, and she understood systems. She looked at the chamber's vent design, the stove placement, the wood storage, and the rope network, and she saw not a single survival solution, but a pattern that could be adapted, repeated, and taught. "Can you build this anywhere?" Ragna asked. "Not this exactly. You need depth below the frost line, which means 6 feet at minimum, more in exposed ground. You need drainage to a lower point, a coulee, a gravel bed, a slope. You need vent shafts at different heights for natural draft. You need dry wood stored on raised rails. And you need to test the air before you trust it. Margaret paused. But the principle works anywhere the earth is deep enough to hold its own temperature. The principle? Earth keeps warmth. Wind steals warmth. A room buried below the wind, with controlled air and dense fuel, will outperform a room built above the wind with the same fuel every time. Ragnar wrote this down. She was the first person to write down anything Marit said, and the act of writing changed the nature of what Marit was doing. She was no longer surviving. She was teaching. Pike objected. He appeared at the hatch on the third Sunday after the blizzard, when 6 people were underground examining the wood stack, and Marit was explaining how to test splits by sound. Pike did not descend. He stood at the surface and said, loudly enough for everyone below to hear, that the chamber was a hazard. He said it had been built without permits, maintained without inspection, and occupied during an emergency without any authority's knowledge or approval. He said children could fall through the weakened roof sections. He said livestock could break through. He said the responsible thing was to seal the chamber under town order until a proper assessment could be made. The 6 people below climbed out and looked at Pike. Among them were Peter Meacham, whose daughter Clara had survived in the chamber, Ragnar Solheim, who was already drawing plans for a school storm shelter, and Tollef Asen's eldest son, who had heard his father say, "I was wrong," and understood what that admission cost. No one agreed with Pike. No one argued with him either. They simply looked at him, and in their silence was a judgment that Pike could feel but could not answer. The chamber had saved a child. His store had not saved anyone. Pike left. The teaching continued. Baptiste Robideau returned on the 2nd day of February, riding the same clay-colored mule, thinner than when he had left, with a cough that rattled in his chest when the wind hit him from the north. His cousin's family had survived the blizzard in St. Joseph, but barely. 3 of the children had been sick with something that took the youngest before the road cleared. He found the settlement changed. The chamber, which had been Marit's secret, and then Marit's embarrassment, and then Marit's gamble, was now the settlement's reference point. People spoke of Breka's shelter, the way they spoke of the church or the store, as a landmark, a fact of geography, a place that existed whether you approved of it or not. Baptiste descended the ladder and stood in the lower bay for a long time, his hand on the clay wall, his eyes moving from the stove to the vents to the wood stack. Marit had kept everything as he had taught her. The vents were clear. The draft was steady. The wood was sorted and stacked with air gaps. The rope lines were taut and knotted. He found details she had added on her own. A second candle holder mounted near the intake vent, so she could check the draft without carrying a light across the room. A notched stick hung from a peg near the stove, marked with lines that corresponded to the wood supply. Each line representing a quarter cord, so she could track consumption without counting individual splits. A slate board mounted near the ladder with chalk marks recording the temperature at different points in the chamber, taken at different times of day over the weeks since the blizzard. "You measured," Baptiste said. "Every day. Twice a day." He read the chalk marks. 40 degrees at the storage wall at dawn. 52 at the stove corner at midday. 44 at the entrance bay after the hatch was opened and closed. The numbers told a story of consistency, the Earth's temperature fluctuating within a narrow band regardless of what the surface air did. "This is how you teach it," Baptiste said. "Not with words, with numbers. People argue with words. They cannot argue with a board that says the same thing every morning." They spent 3 days mapping the full extent of the chamber. Baptiste had suspected from the beginning that the cache was larger than its main room. The side passage, the one Marit had broken through during the blizzard, led to a secondary storage bay, smaller than the main room but structurally sound. Beyond it, the old drainage channel connected to a natural gravel seam that ran toward the coulee. The total underground space was larger than Marit's shack. They found, in the secondary bay, objects that confirmed the cache's history. Old iron hinges, hand-forged, with the square taper of pre-industrial work. Dry kindling bundled with bark twine. Clay jars, 2 intact and 1 cracked, containing nothing but dust that smelled faintly of grease. Old pemmican, or tallow, long decomposed. A broken steel trap with a spring that still held tension. 3 serviceable axe heads, their handles rotted away but the iron sound waiting for new wood. And more hardwood. 2 additional cords of white oak and hickory, stacked in the secondary bay on the same raised rails, protected by the same earth and the same collapsed roof that had sealed the main chamber for decades. Baptiste held one of the cart pins, the iron shelf pegs that had been repurposed from Red River cart axles, and turned it in his fingers. "The men who built this expected to return," he said. Marit looked at the pin, the jars, the bundled kindling, the careful stacking. "They did," she said. "In a way." Baptiste looked at her. He did not smile. He was not a man who smiled for sentiment, but his eyes held something that Marit recognized because she had seen it in her father's eyes when she solved a problem he had not posed. Recognition, not of cleverness, but of attention. She had listened. She had watched. She had learned not because someone forced her to learn, but because the knowledge was there, and she was the kind of person who reached for it. He gave her his old cardall that evening. It was a small tool, a handled spike used for punching holes in leather and canvas, worn smooth by decades of grip, with a tip that Baptiste kept sharp enough to pierce frozen hide. He placed it on the table in the shack and said, "Do not make them admire you. Make them practice." "What do you mean?" "Admiration does not survive a storm. Practice does. If they admire you, they will come to you when the wind blows. If they practice, they will save themselves." Marit took the awl and turned it in her hand. The handle was warm from Baptiste's pocket. The tip caught the lamplight. She placed it in the Bible, next to Pike's letter, and the $27, now 21, after the lamp oil and the flour she had bought since November. 3 things in a Bible: a debt, a diminishing reserve, and a tool for making holes in things that resisted. Baptiste weakened through February. The coffee had carried back from St. Joseph settled deep and did not clear. He continued to work. He was not a man who stopped working because his body objected, but the work slowed, and the silences between his instructions grew longer. He taught Marit 2 more critical skills during those weeks. The first was reading spring water. February's cold kept the ground frozen, but Baptiste knew that March would bring thaw, and thaw would bring water, and water underground was the one enemy that the chamber's earth insulation could not defeat. He showed her how to find the natural drainage paths, the gravel seams, the clay slopes, the places where water would collect and where it would move. He showed her how to cut a relief trench with a gravel backfill that channeled water away from the storage walls. He showed her how to test the walls for moisture by pressing a dry cloth against the clay and checking for dampness after an hour. "Water is patient," he said. "It does not attack. It waits. It finds the low point and it fills it. Your job is to give water a lower point that is not your floor." The second skill was harder to name. It was not construction or maintenance or fire management. It was the ability to see a space the way the people who built it had seen it, to stand in a room and understand why each post was where it was, why each vent was angled as it was, why the rails were 3 inches high and not 2 or 4. Baptiste called it listening to the builders, and he taught it by asking Marit questions she could not answer and then waiting while she figured them out. Why is the exhaust vent in the willow clump and not in open ground? Marit thought. Because willows are flexible. Snow bends them, but does not break them. The vent stays accessible even under drift. Why are the rails 3 inches? Because the clay sweats in spring. 3 inches lets air move beneath the wood. 2 inches packs with dust and blocks the air. 4 inches wastes space. Why is the entrance on the north side? This one took longer. Marit stood at the entrance and looked at the landscape. North meant the entrance faced the prevailing winter wind, which seemed wrong. You would expect the entrance on the lee side. But Baptiste waited, and Marit thought, and then she understood. Because snow drifts on the lee side, the south side buries first. The north side, facing the wind, gets scoured. The wind keeps the entrance clear. Baptiste nodded. He did not praise her. He moved on to the next question. The praise was in the moving on. In the 3rd week of February, Baptiste told Marit he was leaving. His cousin's family needed him north. His cough was not improving, and he wanted to reach St. Joseph before the spring mud made the road impassable. He did not say he was dying. He said he was tired, which in a man who had worked every day for 64 years meant the same thing. He left on a morning when the sky was the color of a pearl, gray-white, luminous, holding the light without releasing it. Marit stood at the picket line and watched him mount the mule. Soul nuzzled the mule's flank. The mule stood patient, the way mules do. "Keep the vents clear," Baptiste said. He said it the way a man says the thing he most needs to hear himself say, the words that contain everything he has taught, compressed into 5 syllables. Marit watched him ride north along the coulee road until the gray horse and the gray sky merged. She went back to the chamber. She descended the ladder. She found his mitten on the 3rd rung, stiff with clay dust, creased at the thumb from years of grip, left behind either by accident or by the kind of intention that looks like accident. She hung it on a peg near the exhaust vent, where the warm air from below would keep it dry, and she left it there. The mitten hung in the draught like a hand waving from a long distance. Marit looked at it once and climbed the ladder. She did not see Baptiste Robideau again. Word came in April that he had died at his cousin's home in St. Joseph, quietly, in his sleep, with the cough finally still. The cousin sent Marit his mule, which arrived with a Métis boy who said only, "He told me to bring her to the woman with the horse." The mule's name, the boy said, was Terre, which meant earth. Marit did not know if Baptiste had named her that or if the name had always been there, but she kept it, because the name was right and because naming things right was something Baptiste would have considered important. The April thaw came hard. Warm air pushed in from the southwest. Snow that had been frozen since November turned to water in a matter of days, and the water ran. It ran across the prairie in sheets. It pooled in every low spot. It poured down the coulee in a torrent that rose 3 feet above the normal bank and swept debris, ice, and deadfall into the Pembina River. The chamber flooded. Not catastrophically, not at first. Marit noticed it on the morning of April 9th, when she descended the ladder and found an inch of water on the clay floor of the lower bay. The drainage channel that Baptiste had cleared was flowing, but the volume overwhelmed it. Water seeped through the north wall where the clay packing had cracked over the winter, and it pooled against the base of the wood stack where the rails, 3 inches above the floor, suddenly did not seem high enough. She worked the drainage trench first. She dug it deeper with a spade, following the natural slope toward the gravel seam that ran south. The gravel was packed with silt and frozen debris. She broke through it with the axe and the cardall, punching holes in the compacted gravel until water began to move through it in a muddy stream. By noon, the flow had increased, and the standing water on the floor had dropped to half an inch. But the north wall continued to seep. The cracks in the clay were widening as the frost retreated from the earth, and water found every gap. Marit packed the cracks with fresh clay mixed with grass, the same chinking technique she had used on the shack walls, but the water pushed through the new packing within hours. Pike chose this moment to escalate. He appeared at the hatch with a document, not a letter this time, but a filed claim, stamped at the land office, asserting that the underground chamber sat partially on ground that was not covered by Marit's homestead filing. The claim was based on a survey discrepancy. Pike argued that the swale where Sol had first stopped was 6 rods beyond the northwest corner of Marit's 160 acres, and that the chamber, extending south from that point, crossed onto open territory. If the chamber's on open ground, Pike said, it belongs to whoever files first. I have filed. Marit looked at the document. She looked at Pike. He was standing in ankle-deep snowmelt with mud on his boots and the expression of a man who has found, after months of patience, the lever he has been looking for. The chamber's physical salvation meant nothing if its legal ground could be pulled away. The entrance is on my claim, Marit said. The entrance, perhaps. The chamber extends. Underground rights follow the surface boundary. If the surface is not yours, the space below it is not yours either. Have you surveyed? I have filed. The distinction mattered. Filing was not the same as proving. Pike had submitted a claim based on his reading of the boundary, but the actual survey up, the chain and compass measurement that would determine exactly where Marit's 160 acres ended and open territory began, had not been done. Surveys in Dakota Territory were slow, expensive, and scheduled by the land office on a timeline that had nothing to do with individual disputes. Pike was betting that the threat alone would be enough, that Marit, faced with a legal challenge on top of a physical emergency, would accept a settlement, sign over the chamber rights in exchange for debt forgiveness, or sell the claim outright, or simply stop fighting because fighting on 2 fronts at once was more than one person could sustain. He was almost right. The chamber was flooding. The wood stack was at risk. 5 families had stored seed grain in the secondary bay at Marit's invitation, grain that represented their spring planting and their fall survival. If the water reached the grain, the damage would extend far beyond Marit's own situation. But Pike had miscalculated in one respect. He had assumed that Marit's allies would scatter under pressure. Instead, the flooding drew them in. Pater Measham arrived first because Louisa had told him about the water and because his daughter Clara was alive because of the chamber, and debts of that weight do not dissolve with legal threats. He brought a shovel and his eldest son, who was 14 and strong enough to dig. Tolef Asen's sons came next, because Tolef Huas, who could not dig himself, his frostbitten hand still healing, sent them with his tools and his authority. Help the Brecka woman, he told them. She earned it. Ragna Solheim came because she understood that the chamber was not just Marit's shelter, but a proof of concept for the school's storm room she was planning, and if the concept drowned, the plan drowned with it. Together, they did what Marit could not do alone. They cut a relief trench from the lower bay's north wall to the gravel seam, 8 feet long and 2 feet deep, lined with flat stones to prevent collapse. They packed the wall cracks with clay mixed with straw and gravel, a heavier, more water-resistant mixture than clay alone. They propped the west wall where the water pressure had begun to bow the clay inward. They moved the seed grain to the upper bay above the flood line. They worked in mud and cold water for 2 days, and when they finished, the drainage was flowing freely and the floor was dry. Marit stood in the lower bay after they left and looked at the walls. The new packing was rough, unprofessional, applied in haste by people who had never done underground work before. But it held. The water flowed where the trench directed it. The grain was safe. The wood was dry. She had not saved this alone. She had saved it by teaching others enough that they could help when help was needed. Baptiste's words came back to her with a weight that was new because she now understood what he had meant. Do not make them admire you. Make them practice. The people who dug the trench had not come because they admired Marit Brecka. They had come because they understood the chamber, because they had seen it work, because they had begun to practice the principles themselves, and because defending the chamber was now defending their own knowledge. If this story reminds you that preparation is not something you do alone, share it with someone who understands that survival is built long before danger arrives. Pike's filed claim remained unresolved. The survey would not happen until summer, and until then, the document was a threat without force, a piece of paper asserting a boundary that no one had measured. Marit placed it in the Bible next to Pike's original letter and the cardall and the thinning stack of currency. The Bible was becoming less a book and more an archive of the pressures that had tried to break her and had not yet succeeded. Outside, the thaw continued. The coulee ran high. The prairie turned to mud that sucked at boots and hooves and wheel rims. Spring was coming, and spring in Dakota Territory was not relief. It was a different kind of work, on different ground with different dangers. But the chamber held. The vents breathed. The wood was dry. And Marit Brecka, who had entered the winter with 1 3/4 cords of bad cottonwood and a dead husband and a debt she could not pay, stood in a room that the earth itself kept warm and planned the work that remained. The hostile skeptic had filed his paper. The mentor was gone. The practical doubter had become an ally. The authority skeptic had admitted his error. The community was changing, and the change was irreversible because it was built on practice, not admiration. What remained was the question of what Marit Brecka would become now that survival was no longer the only thing she needed. Spring opened the ground and changed the work. Snow receded in patches, exposing the coulee banks, the old cart trace, the willow clumps that marked the vent shafts. The prairie turned from white to brown to a tentative, cautious green that appeared first in the low spots where snowmelt collected. Soul's foal came in the second week of March, a filly, long-legged and dark, born in the upper bay of the chamber where the earth held the temperature steady and the mare could labor without wind. Marit named her Grun, which meant ground because the filly was born beneath it. The snowmelt revealed the full outline of the cache system for the first time. From the coulee rim, looking north, Marit could trace the old cart trace, a shallow depression in the sod, barely visible, running from the river crossing toward a point that lined up with the chamber's main entrance. The trail had been worn by decades of Red River cart traffic and then erased by decades of grass, but the earth remembered. The ruts held water differently. The grass grew shorter where the packed ground resisted roots. Baptiste had followed this trace. The men who built the cache had followed it before him. The trail connected the Pembina River, the old fur trade highway, to a supply point that someone, generations ago, had considered important enough to build underground and stock with hardwood and provisions. Marit stood on the coulee rim in April sunlight and saw the logic that had been invisible under snow. The cache sat at the intersection of a travel route and a drainage channel, sheltered by the coulee from northwest wind, positioned where the clay subsoil was deep enough to dig and firm enough to hold. The builders had chosen well. Marit intended to build on what they chose. Etienne Caron arrived in May with iron on his back. He was 29 years old, métis, a blacksmith's apprentice who had worked the forge at St. Joseph since he was 14. He had been Baptiste's helper on freight runs. the reluctant kind, the kind who carried loads because carrying was the work, but who did not pretend to enjoy the hauling. What he enjoyed was shaping metal, heating it, bending it, joining it into things that fit together and held. He came because Baptiste had told him before dying that the woman on the breckie claim needed strap hinges for an underground hatch, and that the woman was worth helping because she checked her vents before she slept. Baptiste had not said help her. He had said she needs hinges, and Etienne had understood the instruction beneath the statement. He rode a brown gelding and led a pack mule loaded with forge tools, iron stock, and a canvas roll that held hinge blanks he had already roughed out before leaving St. Joseph. He found Marit at the chamber entrance, replacing sod blocks that the thaw had loosened. "Baptiste sent me," he said. Then, correcting himself, "Baptiste told me you needed hinges." Marit looked at the iron on the mule. She looked at the man. He was not large, but he stood the way Smiths stand, weight forward, shoulders set, hands at his sides as if waiting for something to grip. His face was dark, weather-marked, calm. He did not look at her the way Pike looked at her, measuring what she was worth. He did not look at her the way Toluf looked at her, calculating what she lacked. He looked at the hatch and the sod blocks and the vent cap and said, "Where do you want the hinge load carried?" It was the right question, not "Do you need help?" which presumed weakness, not "What are you doing?" which presumed confusion. Where do you want this carried? A question that acknowledged the work in progress and offered to join it without redirecting it. Inside, Marit said, down the ladder, set them on the flat stone near the stove. Etienne carried the iron inside without comment. He descended the ladder carrying 30 pounds of strap blanks and hinge stock in a canvas sling over one shoulder, his free hand on the rungs, his feet sure on the oak. He set the iron on the stone. He looked around the chamber the way a craftsman looks at a space where his work will live, not at the room itself, but at the joints, the connections, the places where metal would meet wood. "The hatch needs hinges that open from inside," he said, "in case snow blocks the top." "Yes." "And a latch that holds from both sides." "Yes." "I need a forge. Is there flat ground near the vent where the smoke will not choke the draft?" They built the forge together. Etienne set it on the coulee bank, 30 yards from the exhaust vent, using flat stones from the creek bed and a bellows he had carried in pieces. The forge was small, adequate for hinge work, not for heavy shaping, and its smoke rose from the coulee in a thin column that the settlers on the Pembina road could see for miles. People who saw it and asked were told that the Brequet claim had a smith, which was almost true and entirely misleading, because Etienne Caron was not Marit's smith. He was a man who had brought hinges because a dead friend told him they were needed, and who stayed because the work was not finished. The hinges took 4 days. Etienne heated the blanks in the forge, hammered them on the anvil stone, and shaped the strap ends into curves that would wrap the hatch frame and hold against the pull of snow weight. He forged the pins from solid rod stock, tapered at the ends to allow removal if the hinges ever needed replacing. He forged the latch, a flat bar with a pivot and a keeper that could be thrown from above or below so that a person inside the chamber could seal the hatch and a person outside could open it. While Etienne worked the iron, Marit worked the wood. She cut new hatch planks from the soundest oak in the secondary bay, replacements for the originals, which had cracked during the blizzard and Pike's attempted entry. She fitted them on cross beams she had cut and mortised herself, using techniques Baptiste had shown her, squared joints, pegged connections, no nails where wood on wood would hold. They did not talk much during the work. They did not need to. The conversation was in the work itself, in the fit of hinge to frame, in the alignment of latch to keeper, in the way Etienne adjusted a pin angle after watching Marie test the hatch swing and finding it heavy on one side. He did not explain the adjustment. He made it. She noticed. The hatch swung true. On the fourth evening, they sat outside the forge on the coulee bank and ate bread and beans from a shared pot. The sun was low, and the light was the amber color that comes in late spring when the dust is not yet thick enough to filter it. Sol and Grun stood in the new grass below the bank. Tere, Baptisten's mule, stood apart the way mules do, patient and separate. "The hinges are good," Marit said. "The frame is good," Etienne said. "The hinges are only as good as what holds them." It was not courtship. Not yet. It was the recognition that sometimes happens between people who work well together. The understanding that competence, shared and mutual, is a form of trust, and that trust built through work is harder to shake than trust built through words. Etienne did not leave when the hinges were done. He built the double-door snow vestibule over the hatch, a roofed frame with two doors that created an airlock, preventing wind from entering the chamber when the outer door was opened. He built rotating vent caps from tin and barrel hoops that Merritt had salvaged from Pike's store when Pike was not watching. He forged a set of emergency cash boxes, tin-lined wooden containers, sized to hold matches wrapped in waxed cloth, dried beans, flour in oiled paper, lamp oil in sealed jars, and a slate tally for recording supplies. Each improvement was discussed, designed, and executed as a partnership. Etienne did not build things for Marit, he built things with her. The distinction mattered because it established the pattern that would hold for the rest of their lives. Two people working the same problem from different materials. She from wood and earth, he from iron and fire, and meeting at the joint. By midsummer, Marit's teaching had spread beyond the immediate settlement. Ragna Solheim built the first satellite shelter, a storm room attached to the schoolhouse, dug 4 feet below grade, banked with sod, vented with tin pipes, and stocked with a cord of oak that Marit helped select and stack. The room was smaller than the chamber, simpler in design, but it followed the principles: depth below the frost line, vent shafts at different heights, raised wood rails, a rope line from the school door to the shelter entrance. Louisa's family built the second. Petter dug a root cellar conversion on their claim, deepening an existing cellar to 8 feet, banking the walls with clay and straw, adding a vent shaft and a small stove. Louisa insisted on the rope line. She strung it herself, knotting it every 10 feet, from the house to the cellar, to the barn, to the road marker. She tested it blindfolded, walking the route with her eyes covered and her hands on the rope, counting knots until she reached each destination. Tollef Asen's sons built the third, following plans that Tollef drew on paper from his chair, his damaged hands unable to hold tools, but his mind still mapping the work with the precision of a man who had built structures for 40 years. His design was different from Marit's, shallower, wider, with a central hearth instead of a corner stove, but it used the same physics: earth insulation, controlled draft, dense fuel, raised storage. By late summer, Marit had taught the method to 14 families. She taught it through demonstration, not lecture. She brought people to the chamber. She showed them the vents. She lit a candle and let them watch the draft. She struck a piece of hickory against the wall and let them hear the ring. She gave them rope and showed them the knots. She taught them the things Baptiste had taught her: water before air, before fire. Read the ground, listen to the builders. Check the vents before you sleep and after you wake. And the thing that Baptiste had not taught her because she had learned it herself: the chamber works because it does not fight the earth. It uses the earth. The earth is not the enemy. The wind is the enemy. The earth is the weapon. She did not charge for the teaching. Pike called this foolishness. He said she was giving away the only advantage she had, that knowledge without a price was knowledge without value, that she was undermining her own position by making herself unnecessary. Marit heard this report secondhand from Louisa, who heard it from the store, and she laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since Ole's death, and the sound surprised her. She laughed because Pike's objection contained its own refutation. If the knowledge spread, it could not be taken away. If it could not be taken away, it could not be used as leverage. If it could not be used as leverage, Pike's power over the settlement, the power of the man who sold necessities on credit and waited for failure, was diminished, not by force, by practice. This was what enraged Pike, not the chamber, not the wood, not Marit's survival. What enraged him was the teaching, because teaching distributed power, and distributed power could not be repossessed. The winter of 1889 arrived without the deceptive mild opening that had preceded the children's blizzard. This winter announced itself honestly, cold in November, colder in December, the kind of steady, grinding cold that tested structures and stores without the dramatic violence of a single catastrophic storm. The settlement was better prepared. 3 shelters were stocked. 6 families had rope lines. 11 households had increased their hardwood stores, buying or hauling oak and elm instead of relying on cottonwood alone. Ragna Solheim had drilled her students on the route from the school door to the storm room and back, blindfolded, until every child could walk it by not count alone. The test came not as a blizzard, but as a ground storm, a fast-moving squall that hit in early February, dropping visibility to nothing for 6 hours and dropping the temperature from 15 degrees to 28 below in less than 90 minutes. It was not the children's blizzard. It was smaller, shorter, less lethal across the region. But it was enough. Pike's nephew, a boy of 16 named Arvid, hired to drive a freight wagon between the store and a claim south of the Kuliai, was caught in the storm with 2 other boys and a team of draft horses. They were 4 miles from town, 2 miles from the nearest farmhouse, and less than a quarter mile from one of Marit's rope lines when the wind erased the road. Arvid found the rope by accident. His lead horse stumbled into the anchor post, and Arvid, climbing down to check the animal, felt the knotted line under his gloves. He did not know whose rope it was. He did not know where it led, but he knew what rope lines meant because every child in the settlement now knew what rope lines meant, and he followed it. The rope led to the satellite dugout that Marit had helped Louisa's family build the previous spring. Arvid and the 2 boys crawled inside. The dugout was small, cold, and dark, but it was below grade, out of the wind, and stocked with matches, kindling, and a quarter cord of oak. They lit the stove. They waited. The storm passed in 6 hours, and when it cleared, all 3 boys were alive. The horses were standing in the dugout's entrance trench, and Arvid was sitting on the floor with his hands around a tin cup of melted snow and his face white with the understanding of how close he had come to the same death that had taken the unnamed settler found 40 rods from his barn a year before. Pike arrived at Marit's shack the next day. He came on foot, which was unusual. Pike rode everywhere. Walking signified something, either that his horse was lame or that he wanted the time a walk provided to prepare what he intended to say. His hands were wrapped in cloth. Frostbite. He had tried to reach Arvid during the storm and had been driven back, the same way Tollef had been driven back during the children's blizzard. The cold did not distinguish between good men and bad men. It took what it could reach. Marit was outside the shack, splitting wood. Etienne was at the forge, shaping a replacement pin for the school shelter's hatch. Tollef was inside the shack, sitting by the stove, visiting because he visited now, weekly, sometimes twice, bringing cheese or dried meat and taking away conversation that he would not admit he needed. Pike stopped at the edge of the yard. He looked at Marit. He looked at the axe in her hands. He looked at the chamber's exhaust vent, where a thread of smoke rose from the willow clump into cold air. "The line saved them," he said. He did not say, "You saved them." He could not say that. The distance between acknowledging the rope and acknowledging the woman who had strung it was a distance Pike's pride could not cross, not yet, possibly not ever. But the community heard what he said, because Tolef was listening through the shack wall, and Etienne was listening from the forge, and Louisa, who had walked over to check on Clara's old quilt, was listening from the path. "The line saved them" was enough. Merritt did not respond. She set the axe down and waited. Pike had not walked 2 miles in the cold to deliver a compliment. He had come because the arithmetic of the settlement had changed, and Pike was a man who understood arithmetic. "I will sign over the note," Pike said. "The $43, for the cost of the goods. No interest." Marrett looked at him. The note, the original debt for nails, flour, coffee, and stovepipe that had been Pike's lever since November 1887, was the last piece of financial pressure he held over the claim. Signing it over at cost meant forgiving the accumulated interest and late charges, which had grown the debt to nearly $60 on paper. "Why?" Marrett asked. Not from suspicion, from the need to hear him say it in front of witnesses. Pike's jaw worked. His wrapped hands hung at his sides. The frostbite had turned his fingertips dark, and the cold had taken something from him that he could not name. Not health exactly, but the certainty that his way of operating was the right way. His nephew was alive because of a rope line. His hired boys were alive because of a dugout stocked with wood. His own hands were damaged because the storm had outrun his preparations. The settlement had survived the second winter better than the first, and the difference was not his store credit or his ledger. The difference was practice. "Because the line saved them," Pike said again. He produced the note from his coat. He signed across the face of it, carefully, because the frostbitten fingers did not grip the pen well, and handed it to Merritt. She took it. She looked at the signature. She folded the paper and placed it in her coat pocket, not in the Bible. The Bible was for pressures that remained. This pressure was finished. Pike turned and walked back toward the coulee road. Tolef watched him go from the shack window. Etienne watched from the forge. Louisa watched from the path. No one said anything. The silence was the sound of an account closing, not with triumph, not with forgiveness, but with the plain settling of a balance that had been wrong for too long. Etienne asked Marie to marry in June, after they finished the school shelter's second vent shaft. They were standing on the coulee bank, covered in clay dust, and the question arrived without preamble because Etienne did not believe in preamble. "I can build hinges," he said. "I need someone who checks vents," she said. It was not a proposal in any form that a church would recognize, but both of them understood what had been asked and what had been answered. They married in late spring at the settlement church, with Tolef as witness and Louisa's children throwing wildflowers they had picked from the coulee bank. Ragnar Solheim read a passage. Saul stood at the hitching rail outside and did not stamp. Marrett kept the Brecca name on the claim filing, and on the first map she drew of the shelter system, a hand-drawn chart showing the locations of the underground rooms, the rope lines, the vent markers, and the stocking lists. She kept it because the claim had been Ole's before it was hers, and because the name Brecca was written on a rail cross 40 yards from the shack door, and because the dead do not need 160 acres, but they deserve to have their work remembered on the land where they did it. Etienne took no offense. He was a man who understood that names carried weight, and that the weight was not his to rearrange. The years compress the way years do when the crisis is past and the work becomes routine. Marit and Etienne raised 2 children, a boy named Halvor, born in 1890, and a girl named Christy, born in 1892. They took in an orphan niece, the daughter of a settler who died of typhus in 1894, and raised her alongside their own. The claim expanded. Etienne built a proper cabin, larger, tighter, with a stone foundation and a root cellar that connected to the original chamber through a passage he dug and she shored. The forge grew. The schoolhouse grew. The settlement grew. By the mid-1890s, the Pembina Road settlement had 7 marked shelters, 2 root cellar conversions, 3 banked dugouts, 1 schoolhouse storm room, and Marit's original fur trade cache, still standing, still stocked, still holding its temperature at 40 degrees when the surface dropped below zero. Every October, families brought 1 armload of dry hardwood, 1 sealed jar, and 1 length of rope. The wood was stacked on raised rails. The jars were dated and shelved. The rope was tested, knotted, and strung. Children learned to count knots by touch. They walked the rope lines blindfolded as part of the school year's first lesson every fall. Ragna Solheim made it a game, fastest time from school door to shelter. And the children who won bragged the way children brag about things they do not understand are serious. They bragged about knot counts and vent checks and the temperature of deep earth. And in their bragging was the survival of knowledge that had traveled from a stone dairy in Norway to a fur trade cache in Dakota, to a school teacher's chalk marks on a board. Marit became known not as the woman in the mole hole, though the phrase persisted in the mouth of men who had not updated their opinions since 1887, but as the person who made new settlers walk their storm route blindfolded before their first winter. She stood at the property line with a strip of cloth and a length of rope and said, "Find your barn." If they could not find their barn with their eyes covered, she told them they were not ready for January, and she did not let them argue about it because argument was not preparation. She kept 1 split of the original hickory above the stove in the cabin, too valuable as memory to burn. The hickory had dried another decade since she first struck it with her knuckle in the lower bay, and it was now so hard that a nail bent against its grain. She kept it the way other people kept photographs, as evidence that something had been real. Children asked about the horse. Visitors asked about the horse. People who heard the story secondhand and traveled to the Pembina Road to see the shelter system asked about the horse. Did the horse really find the fort? Did the horse really refuse the Snowdrift? Marit always gave the same answer. She refused the wrong ground, that was enough. Sul lived to 23, which was old for a draft horse in Dakota Territory. She died in the spring of 1901, lying down in the grass outside the chamber's entrance hatch, with Grun standing beside her. Marit sat with the mare for the last hour, her hand on Sul's neck, feeling the pulse slow and stop. She buried Saul on the coulee bank, within sight of the vent cap, and nailed the mare's last horseshoe above the chamber door, black iron against gray oak, curved and worn and permanent. Marit Brecka Caron died in 1921, on the claim she had held for 34 years, in the cabin that Etienne built and she heated. She was 57. The cough she had carried since the blizzard winter, the one that started when she cleared the vent shaft with bare hands in blowing snow, had never fully left, and it took her in a late winter that was, by all accounts, mild. She was buried beside Ole, whose rail cross had been replaced twice but whose name was still legible, and beside Sol, whose grave had sunk into the coulee bank but whose horseshoe still hung on the door. Etienne survived her by 9 years. He kept the forge running. He kept the vents clear. By the time of Marit's death, 31 families along the Pembina Road and into the neighboring school districts had adopted some part of the system she taught. Not all built underground shelters. Some dug storm cellars. Some banked their existing root cellars and added vents. Some simply strung rope lines and stocked emergency caches. The variations did not matter. What mattered was the practice, the repeated habitual act of preparing for what the sky would eventually send, carried out every October by people who had learned it from people who had learned it from a woman who had learned it from a Métis freighter who had learned it from the men who packed a cache beneath the prairie and never returned. The shelter practice spread not as a formal invention, not as a patent or a published design, but as repeated habit. Rope lines before the first storm. Vents checked with candle smoke. Dry wood raised from damp floors. Hatches marked with poles taller than drift height. These were small acts, boring acts, the kind of acts that people performed without thinking about where they came from, which was exactly how Marit wanted it. Knowledge that required attribution was knowledge that could be disputed. Knowledge that became habit was knowledge that survived. Marit Brecka lived out her life on the same 160 acres where Ole had driven his first fence post and where Sewell had refused to cross a snowdrift. In later years, she kept the chamber stocked and vented, even when the newer cabin made it unnecessary for daily use. She descended the ladder each October to check the wood, the vents, the drainage, the temperature on the slate board. The numbers were always the same, 40 degrees at the storage wall, 44 at the entrance bay. The earth did not change its mind. On the mantel above the cabin stove, the hickory split sat beside Saul's horseshoe nail and Baptiste's cart awl. 3 objects from 3 sources, the cache, the horse, the mentor, that together told the story of a winter she survived and a method she refused to let die. Warren Pike, at the store counter in December of 1887, had folded a credit letter and told a widow with bad wood and no allies, "You cannot burn a rumor." He had meant it as a closing argument, the final word of a man who believed that talk was worthless and leverage was everything. But the rumor burned. It burned the way hickory burns, slow, steady, without flash, with a coal bed that held heat long after the flame was invisible. The rumor became a rope line. The rope line became a shelter. The shelter became a habit. The habit outlived everyone who laughed. It outlived Pike, who sold the store in 1896 and moved to Fargo, where no one knew his name. It outlived Tolliff, who died in 1903 with full respect and a frostbitten ear he wore like a badge. It outlived Louisa, who taught her grandchildren to count knots. It outlived Ragna Solheim, who retired from teaching in 1915 with a storm shelter plan framed on her wall. Winter wind scraped over the same flat drift where Sewell had planted her hooves and refused to cross. The coulee held its shape. The willow clump still marked the vent. Below ground, the chamber held still air, stacked wood, a clean shaft, and a horseshoe black against the door beam. The last shoe of a mare who had understood before anyone else that the ground beneath the snow was not ground at all, but a room waiting to be entered by someone patient enough to listen. Above ground, the prairie kept taking heat. Below it, Marit Brecka had learned how to keep it.